They say Thanksgiving is about gratitude. But that night, sitting at my mother's $15,000 dinner table, I learned it was really about survival. My name is Marissa Cole, and for 38 years, I was the family failure. While my younger sister Lydia wore designer dresses and collected compliments like trophies, I wore thrift store cardigans and swallowed insults like daily vitamins. At every holiday gathering, my mother Eleanor made sure I knew my place beneath everyone else. But that Thanksgiving, everything changed. "You're not even half the woman your sister is," my mother announced, her voice dripping with contempt as 15 guests watched. A complete disappointment. Lydia's laughter cut through the room like a knife. I should have stayed quiet. I'd done it 1,000 times before. But this time, I was done. "Then maybe Lydia should pay for this dinner," I said, my voice steady as steel. "All $15,000 of it, and the $5,000 in monthly bills I've been covering for the past 5 years. The room went silent. My sister's face drained of color. And then a man stood up, someone I never expected to see again. "She's telling the truth," he said, pulling out a folder thick with bank statements and receipts. "Every word." That was the moment my mother realized I wasn't the failure. I was the one keeping this family alive. What happened next would tear apart decades of lies, expose a conspiracy that destroyed my father, and reveal the most shocking truth of all. I was never meant to survive this family. But I did. And before this story ends, every single person who underestimated me will pay. Stay with me. You won't believe what comes next. My name is Marissa Cole. I'm 38 years old, and for the last decade I've worked as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized accounting firm in Columbus, Ohio. To most people, that sounds stable, respectable even. But to my family, it's never been enough. Nothing I've ever done has been enough. The November air bit at my cheeks as I pulled into the circular driveway of my childhood home that Thanksgiving evening. The Cole mansion loomed before me, a sprawling Victorian built in 1887, its windows glowing warm against the darkening sky. I sat in my 10-year-old Honda Civic for a moment, watching the silhouettes move behind the curtains. 15 guests. My mother always invited exactly 15 guests to Thanksgiving dinner. It made her feel important hosting what she called the event of the season. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My gray wool sweater was clean and pressed. My dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun. No jewelry except my father's old watch. I looked presentable, professional. But I already knew what my mother would say. The front door opened before I could knock. Eleanor Cole stood there in a burgundy silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. At 65, she maintained the same imperious posture she'd had all my life. Chin, slightly raised lips pressed into a line that could shift between a smile and a sneer in an instant. "You're late," she said without greeting. Her eyes traveled down my outfit with the precision of a jeweler examining a flawed stone. "And you wore that, 'Hello, Mother. Happy Thanksgiving.' Don't just stand there. Everyone's already seated." She turned and walked away, leaving me to close the door myself. The dining room was exactly as I remembered from every holiday, birthday, and family gathering of my entire life. The mahogany table stretched nearly the length of the room, set with my grandmother's china and crystal that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. Faces turned toward me as I entered. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends. Most offered weak smiles before quickly looking away. My sister Lydia sat in the place of honor at my mother's right hand. She was radiant in a cream-colored designer dress I recognized from a magazine, spread her blonde hair falling in perfect waves around her shoulders. 3 years younger than me, and somehow she'd managed to make those 3 years look like a different generation. She had that glow, that effortless beauty that turned heads and opened doors. "Oh, good, Marissa's finally here," Lydia announced to the table, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We were about to start without you." I took the only empty seat near the far end of the table between Aunt Patricia and a business associate of my mother's whose name I couldn't remember. An elderly man I didn't recognize sat at the very end watching the scene with sharp, attentive eyes. The meal began with my mother holding court describing the menu in elaborate detail. Herb-crusted prime rib from a specialty butcher in Cleveland. Truffle mashed potatoes. Roasted vegetables from an organic farm she'd discovered. A wine pairing for each course selected by her personal sommelier. She made sure everyone knew exactly how much care, how much expense had gone into this evening. I ate quietly, hoping to make it through the meal without incident. But that was never how these dinners went. "So, Marissa," my mother said, her voice cutting through the pleasant murmur of conversation. "Are you still working at that little accounting office?" The table went quiet. "Yes, Mother. Same firm for 10 years now." 10 years. She said it like a diagnosis. "And still no promotion to partner." "I'm doing well in my position." Lydia laughed a sound like breaking glass. "Doing well, Marissa, you're almost 40 and you're still just an analyst. My hairstylist makes more than you do." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Aunt Patricia suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. My mother leaned forward, slightly warming to her subject. "You know, your sister was just telling me about the new house she and David are building. 5 bedrooms, indoor pool. They broke ground last month." "That's wonderful," I said evenly. "Meanwhile, you're still in that studio apartment near the highway." Eleanor's smile was sharp. "The one with the broken air conditioning you complained about last summer." "I manage fine." "Fine." My mother repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "That's always been your standard, hasn't it?" "Just fine. Never excellent. Never exceptional. Just barely scraping by." She took a sip of wine, letting the words settle over the table. "Your father and I gave you every advantage, and you've done nothing with any of it. No husband, no children, no real career to speak of. You're not even half the woman your sister is." Lydia's laugh rang out again, louder this time, emboldened by my mother's cruelty. "Remember when Marissa got divorced 6 months? Her marriage lasted 6 months before he figured out what a disaster she was." My hands were steady as I set down my fork. I'd learned long ago how to absorb their attacks, how to let the words wash over me without showing pain. But tonight felt different. Tonight something inside me had finally had enough. "Mother," I said quietly, "if I'm such a disappointment, such a burden to this family, then perhaps Lydia should take on some responsibilities." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me." "Perhaps she should pay for this dinner. All $15,000 of it." I looked directly at my sister. "And the $5,000 in monthly bills I've been covering for you for the past 5 years. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Someone's fork clinked against china impossibly loud. Lydia's face had gone white. "What are you talking about?" My mother's voice was ice. "Marissa, this is hardly the time or place. Isn't it?" I kept my voice level calm. "We're talking about family contributions. I thought transparency was important." At the far end of the table, the elderly man I didn't recognize rose slowly to his feet. Every eye turned to him. He was tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "And I have the receipts to prove it." The man moved down the length of the table with deliberate steps, and I realized with a jolt that I did know him. Russell Blake. My father's oldest friend and former business partner. I hadn't seen him since the funeral 5 years ago when he'd stood at the back of the church, his face carved with grief. He'd tried to speak to me that day, but my mother had pulled me away, saying we needed to greet more important guests. Now he stood beside my chair, and I could see he'd aged since then. His silver hair was thinner lines deeper around his eyes. But those eyes were sharp, missing nothing as they swept across my mother's face. "Russell," Eleanor said, and I heard something I'd never heard in her voice before. Fear. "This is a private family dinner. Whatever you think you know." I know everything, Eleanor. He opened the folder he'd been holding, spreading documents across the table in front of the nearest guests. Bank statements, credit card bills, payment confirmations. I know that since Henry died in 2019, Marissa has paid $120,000 of your credit card debt. Gasps rippled around the table. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. That's ridiculous, my mother said, but her voice had lost its edge. Henry left me well provided for. I have my own money. Russell pulled out another sheet, sliding it directly in front of her. This is your bank statement from January 2020, 2 months after Henry passed. The life insurance payout, $450,000. He pulled out another page. This is your statement from June 2021. Balance $8,000. You spent nearly $500,000 in 18 months. Lydia leaned forward, staring at the papers. Mother, is that true? Eleanor's face had gone from pale to flushed. I had expenses. The house was paid off, Russell interrupted. Henry made sure of that before he died. Your expenses were luxury shopping trips to New York, spa weekends in Scottsdale, a country club membership you used twice. He turned to address the table. Would you like to know what Eleanor bought last month alone? An $8,000 Hermes handbag, a $15,000 diamond bracelet, and the catering bill for tonight's dinner, which came to exactly $14,732. I watched my mother's friends exchange glances. Mrs. Peterson from the church committee looked like she'd bitten into something sour. How dare you come into my home and air private financial matters? Eleanor hissed. Your home. Russell's voice was quiet, but it carried. Let's be clear about whose home this is. He produced another document, this one official-looking with a county seal. Property tax bills for this address, 2021, 2022, and 2023. All marked final notice before payment, all paid by Marissa Cole. He looked around the table. Without these payments, the county would have foreclosed. Eleanor and Lydia would have lost this house 2 years ago. The silence was deafening. I felt 15 pairs of eyes on me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see pity or contempt in them. I saw shock, respect, even awe. Lydia's voice came out small, confused. Marissa, why didn't you say anything? I looked at my sister, really looked at her. She seemed younger, suddenly vulnerable in a way I'd never seen. Would you have believed me? She had no answer. My mother's business associate stood abruptly, placing his napkin on his plate. Eleanor, I think I should go. This is clearly a family matter. Don't you dare, my mother snapped, but he was already heading for the door. 2 other guests followed. Within moments, people were making excuses, gathering coats, murmuring apologies. The grand Thanksgiving dinner was disintegrating before our eyes. Russell waited until only family remained. My mother sat rigid in her chair, Lydia beside her, looking lost. Aunt Patricia had started crying quietly. Uncle James stared at his plate like he wished he could disappear into it. You've humiliated me, Eleanor said to Russell, and then turned her fury on me. You both have, in my own home in front of my friends. Stop! The word came out harder than I intended. Just stop, Mother. For once in your life, stop making yourself the victim. Her mouth opened, then closed. I'd never spoken to her like that. Never. Russell's hand rested briefly on my shoulder, a gesture of support. Then he turned back to Eleanor, and his expression shifted into something colder, more dangerous. But the credit cards are just the beginning, he said softly. Shall we talk about what you did to Henry's will? The color drained from my mother's face completely. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes that looked almost like terror. And I realized there were depths to this story I hadn't even begun to understand. The man who spoke was a stranger to most people at this table, but not to me. I recognized him the moment he stood, though I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 years. Russell Blake. 72 years old with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He'd been my father's closest friend since college, his business partner for 30 years, and the only person who'd attended my father's funeral and actually wept. Russell opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a thick manila folder. The sound of paper rustling was the only noise in the room as he walked slowly toward my mother's end of the table. His steps were measured, deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He had all the time in the world, and he knew it. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying that quiet authority I remembered from childhood. "I've been Henry's executor and financial advisor for over 3 decades. When he passed in 2019, he left specific instructions for me to monitor certain accounts, to ensure his family was taken care of properly." My mother's face had gone from pale to flushed. "Russell, this is a family dinner. Whatever business you think you have can wait until—" "It's waited long enough." He set the folder on the table in front of her and opened it. The pages inside were organized with colored tabs, each section meticulously labeled. "These are bank statements from Marissa's checking account. Notice the recurring payments, every month without fail for the last 5 years." He pulled out the first set of statements and held them up so the guests nearby could see the highlighted entries. My cousin Jennifer leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. $1,200 to Nordstrom, Russell read aloud. $1,500 to Neiman Marcus, $800 to the Country Club, $2,000 to American Express, another $1,800 to Visa. He looked up at my mother. "Should I continue? I have 60 months of these." Lydia's voice came out small, confused. "I don't understand. Mom, you said Dad left you plenty of money. You said we were secure." "We are secure," Eleanor snapped, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Russell pulled out another document, this one clipped together with a binder clip. "This is the life insurance policy Henry left to Eleanor. $500,000 paid out in January 2020. He flipped to the next page. "And this is Eleanor's personal bank account statement from December 2021. Balance $4,312. The whispers started then rippling through the guests like wind through leaves. "That's impossible," Aunt Patricia said. $500,000 in less than 2 years. Russell's expression didn't change. "The withdrawals are all documented. March 2020, $28,000 to luxury destinations for a Mediterranean cruise. May 2020, $15,000 to Cartier. July 2020, $32,000 for a complete wardrobe renovation according to the invoice I found." He looked directly at my mother. "Should I read the rest? There are 47 pages of purchases." I watched my mother's hands grip the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white. "You had no right to investigate my finances," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I had every right. Henry made me promise to watch over this family's assets. He knew you had a spending problem, Eleanor. He just didn't know how to stop enabling it." Russell turned to address the table. When the life insurance money ran out, Eleanor opened new credit cards, 7 of them to be exact. She maxed out every single one within 18 months. Lydia was staring at our mother now, her perfect face crumpled with confusion and something that looked like betrayal. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" "Because she didn't want you to know the truth," Russell answered before Eleanor could speak. "She wanted you to believe the family still had money, still had status. So she turned to the one person she knew would never refuse her." His eyes found mine across the table, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected. Respect. Perhaps even admiration. "Marissa started receiving collection calls in late 2021, Russell continued. Eleanor had listed her as an authorized user on 3 of the cards without telling her. When the bills went unpaid, the credit card companies came after Marissa. She could have declared bankruptcy. She could have sued Eleanor for fraud. He paused. Instead, she paid. Every single bill. Every single month. The business associate next to me, whose name I still couldn't remember, was looking at me with his mouth slightly open. Aunt Patricia had tears in her eyes. $120,000, Russell said, letting the number hang in the air. That's what Marissa has paid in the last 5 years to cover Eleanor's debt, and that doesn't include the property taxes. My mother's head snapped up. What? The property taxes on this house. 3 years in arrears. When I checked the county records last week, Marissa paid them, all $43,000. Russell looked around the table, meeting each guest's eyes. Without that payment, this house would have been foreclosed on in August. You'd all be having Thanksgiving dinner somewhere else tonight, if Eleanor had bothered to invite you at all. I could see my mother's mind racing, trying to find an angle, a defense, some way to spin this that wouldn't leave her completely exposed. But there was none. The numbers were there in black and white, highlighted and documented and impossible to deny. Lydia pushed her chair back suddenly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. "Is this true?" she demanded, looking at me, then at our mother. "All of it." I met my sister's eyes. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Would you have believed me?" I asked quietly. "Or would you have laughed just like you did 5 minutes ago?" She flinched. Russell closed the folder carefully, precisely, like a lawyer resting his case. But when he looked at Eleanor again, his expression had changed. There was something harder there now, something that made even my mother lean back slightly in her chair. "But the credit cards are just the beginning," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Shall we talk about what you did to Henry's will?" Russell's question about the will hung in the air like a sword about to fall, but I barely heard it. His words faded into a distant hum as memory pulled me backward, dragging me through decades I'd spent trying to forget. I was 9 years old again, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with my 4th grade report card clutched in both hands. 6 subjects. 6 perfect A's. I'd worked so hard that semester, staying up past bedtime with flashcards, reading ahead in my textbooks, determined to make my parents proud. My father was at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, and when I showed him the report card, his face lit up with genuine joy. He pulled me into a hug and told me I was brilliant, that he was so proud he could burst. My mother was at the counter arranging flowers in a crystal vase, her back to us. When my father called her over to see my grades, she turned and glanced at the paper for maybe 3 seconds. "That's nice, Marissa," she said in the same flat tone she used when commenting on the weather. Then she turned back to her flowers. "Don't forget you have piano lessons at 4. That was it. No hug, no praise, just a reminder of my next obligation. I felt my father's hand tighten on my shoulder, felt him preparing to say something, but he didn't. He never did. 3 days later, Lydia came home from 1st grade with her progress report. Mostly satisfactory marks, but 1 B in reading. My mother swept her up and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time. Within an hour, there were balloons tied to Lydia's chair and a cake from the bakery downtown. My mother made a crown out of construction paper that said, "Reading Star," and Lydia wore it through dinner while everyone clapped. I sat at that table with my perfect report card already forgotten on the hall table, buried under junk mail, and wondered what was wrong with me that excellence earned nothing while mediocrity was celebrated. The memory shifted, lurching forward 10 years. I was 19, home for spring break from my freshman year at Ohio State. The acceptance letter for the full academic scholarship sat on the kitchen counter, and I was so proud I thought I might float away. 4 years of university completely paid for. Only 5 students in the entire college had received it. My mother was in the living room with 16-year-old Lydia, flipping through magazines and pointing out prom dresses. I showed her the letter, my hands shaking with excitement. She barely looked at it. "That's good, dear." Then she returned her attention to Lydia and a photo of a blue sequined gown. "This one would be perfect with your eyes." "Mom, it's a really big deal," I pressed, hating the desperation in my voice. "Only 5 people. Don't get too proud about it, Marissa." My mother's voice had that edge I knew too well, sharp enough to cut. "The truth is, pretty girls like your sister don't need scholarships. They don't need degrees at all. They marry well, and their husbands take care of them." Her eyes traveled over me with barely concealed disdain. You'll need that education because, frankly, no man is going to want to take care of you. You're too plain, too serious. At least you're smart. Use it because it's all you have." Lydia had giggled, and that sound hurt worse than my mother's words. My father found me crying in my old bedroom an hour later. He sat beside me and tried to soften it, tried to explain it away as my mother expressing herself poorly. But we both knew better. She'd meant every word. The final memory came rushing forward, the one that had sent me running and kept me away for 10 years. I was 28, 6 months divorced, raw and broken from a marriage that had failed because I'd chosen someone who treated me exactly the way my mother always had. I'd come to Sunday dinner because my father begged me to, because he said family was supposed to support each other during hard times. My mother spent the entire meal dissecting my failures. How I'd never been wife material. How I'd probably driven my husband away with my intensity. How I should have tried harder to make him happy. Something inside me finally snapped. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping back, and I shouted words I'd held back for 28 years. "Why do you hate me so much? What did I ever do to deserve this? I've spent my entire life trying to be good enough for you, and nothing I do matters." My mother stood too, her face twisted with rage I'd never seen before. "You want to know why? Fine. You are not his real daughter. You never were." The words hit like a physical blow. I turned to my father, waiting for him to deny it, to tell her she'd gone too far to defend me the way he always had in small, inadequate ways. But he just stood there. His face went pale, his mouth opened and closed, and he said nothing. That silence confirmed everything. I ran from that house and swore I'd never come back. Now, sitting at my mother's Thanksgiving table 10 years later, surrounded by the evidence of her crimes and lies, my hands began to tremble. I pressed them flat against the tablecloth and looked at her across the wreckage of the dinner she'd used to humiliate me one more time. "I always knew you hated me," I said quietly, and every person in that room leaned forward to hear. But I never knew why. I met her eyes and held them. Until now. The weight of those words hung in the air between us, and I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions I'd never seen her display so openly. Shock, rage, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. Russell remained standing at the end of the table, his posture unchanged, patient as a statue. He'd been waiting for this moment, I realized. Waiting for years. "You want to know why I'm here tonight?" Russell said, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Why I came to this dinner uninvited. Why I brought these documents, why I've been watching and waiting." He looked around the table at the confused faces of the extended family. "It's because I made a promise to my oldest friend, and I intend to keep it." My mother's hands gripped the edge of the table. "Russell, you have no right to interfere in family matters." "I have every right." His voice was steel now, and even. Eleanor fell silent. "Henry Cole and I met in 1971 freshman year at Ohio State. We were roommates then, business partners, then brothers in every way that mattered except blood. We built Cole and Blake Accounting from nothing, worked side by side for 30 years. I was the best man at his wedding. I held his hand when each of his daughters was born." His eyes found mine across the room. Both of them. The clarification wasn't lost on anyone. My throat tightened. In the fall of 2017, Henry was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. The doctors said he had maybe 2 years if he was lucky, less if he wasn't. He started getting his affairs in order the way any responsible man would. Russell paused, and I saw pain flicker across his face. But in early 2019, he called me to his bedside. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March. Eleanor was out and he'd sent the nurse away. He wanted to talk to me alone. I remembered that spring. My father had been declining rapidly. His breathing labored, his energy fading. I'd visited him every Sunday, sitting by his bed, reading to him from the mystery novels he loved. He'd seemed peaceful, then resigned to what was coming. I hadn't known he was planning anything. Henry looked terrible that day. Russell continued, his voice softer now, touched with grief. gray skin, sunken eyes, but his mind was sharp as ever. He grabbed my wrist with what little strength he had left and said, "Russell, if I die unexpectedly, you have to protect Marissa. Eleanor is planning something. I can feel it." Russell's jaw tightened. I told him he was being paranoid, that the medication was making him anxious, but he wouldn't let go. He made me swear. He said, "My wife is going to try to erase my daughter from my life after I'm gone. You're the only one I trust to stop her." Aunt Patricia made a small sound of distress. Uncle Robert was staring at my mother with undisguised disgust. Henry pulled a key from under his pillow. Russell went on. A small brass key on a blue ribbon. He pressed it into my hand and told me it opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box number 847. He made me promise not to open it until after he died, said it was insurance, said it would protect Marissa when the time came. Russell's voice cracked slightly. I promised him. And then I asked him why he was so certain Eleanor would betray Marissa specifically. The room seemed to hold its breath. He told me the truth that day. The truth about Marissa's parentage, about Eleanor's affair, about why Eleanor had always treated Marissa differently. Russell looked at me and his eyes were kind, almost fatherly. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "She's not my blood, but she's my heart. Marissa is the only one who ever loved me for who I am, not for my money or my name or what I could give her. When I'm gone, Eleanor will try to pretend Marissa never mattered. Don't let that happen." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of her. I wept that day. Russell admitted, his voice rough. I sat in that bedroom and I cried like a child because I knew I was losing my best friend, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But I gave him my word. I promised I would watch over Marissa, that I would make sure Eleanor couldn't destroy what Henry had built, couldn't rewrite history to suit her own narrative. My mother had gone completely still. Even her breathing seemed to have stopped. Henry died 6 weeks later on May 2nd, 2019. Massive heart attack in his sleep. Quick, relatively peaceful. The kind of death you'd wish for someone you love. Russell's expression hardened. Except there was something that didn't sit right with me. 2 weeks before he died, Eleanor had brought a lawyer to the house, a man named Gerald Finch, someone I'd never heard of, not part of Henry's regular legal team. I was there that day for a business matter, and I saw this Finch character leave with a briefcase full of documents. Russell pulled out another paper from his folder, this one with an official-looking seal at the top. I asked the nurse what had happened. She told me Eleanor had Henry sign some papers, said it was just an update to his will, nothing major. But Henry had been heavily medicated that day. The nurse said he could barely hold the pen that Eleanor had to guide his hand to make the signature. Russell's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. 3 days later, I went to Henry's regular attorney, Michael Chen, the man who'd handled Henry's legal affairs for 20 years. Chen told me he knew nothing about any will revision. Said the last time he'd updated Henry's will was in 2016. The implications rippled through the room like an electric current. Lydia's face had gone white. Even some of the extended family members who'd seemed bored earlier were leaning forward now, fully engaged. "I wanted to challenge it immediately," Russell said. "But I had no legal standing. I wasn't family. I was just the business partner, the old friend. So I waited. I watched. I documented everything Eleanor did with Henry's estate. Every purchase, every withdrawal, every bill she ignored. I kept records of every time Marissa quietly stepped in to save this family from financial ruin." He looked at my mother with something approaching contempt. And I waited for the right moment to honor my promise to Henry. Russell reached into his jacket pocket, and the room seemed to lean forward collectively. He pulled out a cream-colored envelope, aged slightly at the edges with my father's handwriting on the front. Just 2 words in his careful script for Marissa. "Henry prepared for this exact scenario," Russell said, holding up the envelope. "This document will change everything." Russell's fingers carefully broke the seal on the envelope, the sound of tearing paper impossibly loud in the silent room. He pulled out several folded documents, aged but well-preserved, and smoothed them flat on the table. The top page was thick paper, official-looking, with the embossed seal of a law firm I recognized. Chen and Associates, my father's longtime attorneys. "This is Henry Cole's last will and testament," Russell announced, his voice formal now, almost ceremonial. "Drafted and executed on November 12, 2015, when Henry was in perfect health and sound mind. Witnessed by Michael Chen, attorney at law, and by Barbara Patterson and James Morrison, both certified notaries and long-standing employees of Chen and Associates." He paused, letting the date sink in. 4 years before Henry died. 2 years before he even got sick. My mother's face had taken on a grayish pallor. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Russell adjusted his reading glasses and began to read aloud, his voice steady and clear. "I, Henry James Cole, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." He skipped down the page to the relevant section. "To my wife, Eleanor Marie Cole, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be paid from my life insurance policy. To my daughter, Lydia Rose Cole, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be paid from my savings account at First National Bank." Lydia's sharp intake of breath was audible. $50,000. Not the entire estate, not the house, not the business shares, not the investment portfolios. Russell continued reading. "To Marissa Jane Cole, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including but not limited to this house and property located at 847 Birchwood Avenue, all shares in Cole and Blake accounting firm, all remaining savings and investment accounts, and all personal property not otherwise designated." He looked up from the document. "The will goes on to specify that this bequest is made in recognition of Marissa's integrity, character, and the genuine love she has shown me throughout my life." The words hit me like a physical force. My father had left me everything. Not because I was his biological daughter, which I wasn't, but because he'd chosen to. Because he'd loved me. My mother finally found her voice. "That will is outdated. Henry changed his mind before he died. He signed a new will in April 2019. "Did he?" Russell's tone was sharp. He pulled another document from his folder and placed it beside the first will. "This is the will that was filed for probate in June 2019, filed by Eleanor's attorney, Gerald Finch. Let's compare them, shall we?" He positioned both documents side by side so those closest could see. Even from where I sat, I could make out my father's signature on both pages, but there was something off about the second one. The letters were shaky, uneven, not at all like the firm, confident signature on the 2015 document. "Henry's signature on the original will is strong and clear," Russell said, pointing. "Look at the capital H, the way he loops the Y at the end of Henry. Very distinctive. Now look at this signature from 2019. His finger moved to the second document. "The H is malformed. The Y trails off into nothing. This is the signature of a man who could barely hold a pen." Uncle Robert had stood up and moved closer to examine the documents. "The slant is different too," he said quietly. "The angle is wrong." "Any handwriting expert would confirm forgery within minutes," Russell said. "But that's not the most damaging evidence. Look at the witnesses." He pointed to the signature lines at the bottom of the 2019 will. "Lydia Rose Cole and Catherine Hartwell, Eleanor's younger sister." All eyes turned to Lydia. She looked utterly lost, her perfect composure completely shattered. "I don't remember signing anything," she whispered. "I mean, Mom asked me to witness some papers, but she said it was just for Dad's medical power of attorney. She said it was routine." "Catherine Hartwell moved to Barcelona in August 2019, Russell continued. 3 months after Henry died. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? She's unreachable, untraceable, and even if we could find her, I doubt she'd testify truthfully about what she signed." My mother's breathing had become audible, quick and shallow. Her hands were trembling where they gripped the table edge. Russell wasn't finished. He reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a smaller piece of paper, this one immediately recognizable. My father's personal stationery, cream-colored with his initials embossed at the top in navy blue. The handwriting was unmistakably his, written in the fountain pen he'd always preferred. "This note was tucked inside the original will," Russell said softly. He held it out toward me. "It's addressed to you, Marissa." I stood on shaking legs and walked the length of the table to take it from his hands. The paper felt fragile, precious. My father's last words to me. I had to read it twice before I could process what it said, my vision blurring with tears I could no longer hold back. "Marissa," I read aloud, my voice breaking. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't trust Eleanor. She married me for money, stayed for security, and I fear she'll do anything to keep it." I had to pause, swallow hard. "You deserved better than this family gave you. Build your own life. You're stronger than you know." The last line nearly undid me completely. "Love, Dad." Not Henry, not your father, just Dad, the way I'd always called him, the way he'd always signed birthday cards and Christmas presents. I looked down the table at my mother through tear-filled eyes. She'd stolen this from me. She'd stolen my father's final gift, his final acknowledgement that I mattered, that I was loved. She'd forged documents, manipulated Lydia, hidden the truth for 5 years while I struggled to keep this family afloat, all so she could maintain her lifestyle and her lies. Something hard and cold settled in my chest, replacing the hurt with something sharper, clearer. I folded the note carefully and tucked it against my heart, then raised my eyes to meet my mother's. When I spoke, my voice was steady, controlled, nothing like the crying girl who'd run from this house 10 years ago. "You stole my inheritance," I said. "You stole Dad's final wishes. You forged his signature and manipulated my sister to cover your crime." I took a step closer, and Eleanor actually flinched. "But that's not the worst thing you did, is it?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched my mother's face cycle through a series of calculations, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. But before Eleanor could formulate a response, a sound broke through the tension. A sob, raw and desperate, coming from the other end of the table. Lydia. My sister's perfect composure had completely shattered. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup, and her shoulders shook with the force of her crying. She looked suddenly young, vulnerable, nothing like the polished woman who'd laughed at me an hour ago. "I didn't know," Lydia gasped out between sobs. "I swear to God, Marissa, I didn't know what I was signing." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, pleading. "Mom came to me in April, 2 weeks before Dad died. She was crying, said Dad was getting worse, that he needed to update some medical documents. She had papers spread out on the kitchen table, and she was shaking, saying we had to hurry before the nurse came back." Eleanor's voice cut through sharp as a blade. "Lydia, be quiet." But Lydia ignored her words, tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for years. She pointed to a line at the bottom and said, "Sign here, honey. It's just a formality for Dad's insurance." I didn't even read it. I just signed where she told me to. Her voice broke. "I didn't know it was a will. I didn't know I was helping her steal from you." "That's enough," Eleanor commanded, her voice rising. "No." Lydia's shout startled everyone. "It's not enough. I'm tired of keeping your secrets, tired of being terrified of you." She turned back to me, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Fear. Raw, bone-deep fear. "Do you know what it's been like being the favorite?" She laughed bitterly. "You think I had it easy because Mom liked me better? I've been her prisoner my entire life." I found myself moving toward her without thinking, drawn by the pain in her voice that mirrored my own in ways I'd never imagined. "When I was 18, I got accepted to UCLA. Lydia continued, her voice steadier now, harder. "Full ride for theater arts. I wanted to act, wanted to move to California and start fresh. Mom forbade it. Said I was too pretty to waste my time on something as common as acting. Said my job was to marry well. not work. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. When I tried to go anyway, she threatened to cut me off completely. No money, no family, nothing. Dad tried to support me, but she wore him down. She always did. The room had gone completely silent except for Lydia's voice. I tried dating in my 20s. Normal guys, good guys. Mom vetoed every single one. Not rich enough, not connected enough, not good enough for the Cole family name. Lydia's hands were shaking. The one time I got serious with someone, a teacher I met at a coffee shop, Mom hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on him. When she couldn't find any, she fabricated some. Told me he was sleeping with other women, showed me fake photos. I broke up with him and found out 2 years later she'd paid someone to create those pictures. I sank into the chair beside her, stunned. This wasn't the life I'd imagined for my sister at all. "I'm 35 years old," Lydia whispered. "I don't have a job because Mom says I don't need one. I don't have my own money because everything goes through her. She monitors my credit cards, reads my text messages, tracks my location on her phone." She looked at our mother with something close to hatred. "The only reason I'm allowed to go anywhere is if she approves it first. I'm not the favorite daughter. I'm her doll, her possession." Eleanor's face had gone rigid, but she said nothing. "Last month I tried to open my own bank account," Lydia continued. "Mom found out within a week. She called the bank, claimed I was mentally unstable, got them to freeze it. Then she sat me down and told me that if I ever tried to be independent again, she'd make sure I ended up with nothing. That everyone would know what a disappointment I was, how I'd betrayed the family." She turned to me, and in her eyes I saw genuine remorse. "So when she told me to laugh at you tonight, to make fun of you in front of everyone, I did it. Because I was scared. Because I've always been scared of her." I reached out slowly and took my sister's hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. For the first time in our lives, I saw her clearly. Not as my enemy, not as the golden child who'd stolen our mother's love, but as another victim of Eleanor's manipulation. "I'm sorry I laughed at you," Lydia said, her voice barely audible. "I've been so jealous of you, Marissa. You escaped. You built a life away from her. You're free in a way I've never been." She squeezed my hand. "Even when you were poor, even when you struggled, you were yours. I've never belonged to myself." I squeezed back, something shifting in my chest. All these years I'd envied her, resented her, thought she had everything while I had nothing. But she'd been suffering too, just in a different way. "Lydia!" Eleanor's voice was ice. "If you say another word—" "What?" Lydia whipped around to face our mother. "What will you do? Cut me off? Destroy my reputation? Go ahead. Marissa survived without you. Maybe I can too." The defiance in my sister's voice was something new, something powerful. But then her expression changed, became uncertain, almost frightened. She looked at me, then at Russell, then back at me. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something Mom made me promise never to tell you." She took a shaky breath. "But you need to know the truth. You deserve to know." My heart began to pound. Lydia's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, and I had to lean in to hear her. "You're not Dad's biological daughter." The words landed like a punch to the stomach. I'd known, of course. My mother had screamed it at me 10 years ago, and my father's silence had confirmed it. But hearing it said aloud here in front of everyone made it real in a way it had never been before. "I know," I said quietly. "Mom told me years ago." Lydia's eyes widened. "You knew, all this time you knew, and you never said anything." What was I supposed to say? I looked down at our joined hands. That the woman who called herself my mother had an affair, that the man who raised me wasn't my biological father. What good would that have done? Russell cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. His expression was grave, weighted with knowledge he'd clearly been carrying for years. "Marissa, there's more to the story than what Eleanor told you in anger. Much more." I looked up at him, and something in his face made my pulse quicken. "Henry discovered the truth in 2010. Russell began, his voice measured and careful. He found old letters Eleanor had hidden correspondence with a man named Paul Anderson. When he confronted Eleanor, she admitted to the affair, admitted that you weren't his biological child. He paused, and I saw pain flicker across his features. Henry came to my office the next day. I'd never seen him so devastated. He sat in the chair across from my desk and wept. The image of my father crying broke something inside me. He'd always been so strong, so steady. Henry ordered DNA tests, Russell continued. He needed to know for certain. When the results came back confirming you weren't his biological daughter, I thought he'd be angry. I thought he'd want revenge, want to hurt Eleanor the way she'd hurt him. Russell's voice softened. But instead he looked at me and said, "She's my daughter in every way that matters. I won't abandon her because of Eleanor's betrayal." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. "He made me promise never to tell you," Russell said. "He said you'd been through enough pain already that knowing the truth would only hurt you more. He wanted you to remember him as your father, not as the man who'd been deceived." Russell's jaw tightened. "But he also made me promise to protect you after he was gone, because he knew Eleanor would use the truth as a weapon." My mother had remained eerily silent through all of this, her face a mask I couldn't read. "Paul Anderson," Russell said, and the name hung in the air like smoke. "He's a businessman, reasonably successful, moderately wealthy. In 1985, he and Eleanor had an affair that lasted approximately 6 months. When Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, she broke things off and never told Henry the child might not be his." Russell pulled yet another document from his seemingly endless folder. "But Paul suspected, and Eleanor, being Eleanor, saw an opportunity." He held up what looked like bank statements, columns of numbers highlighted in yellow. Starting in 1986, Paul Anderson began making monthly payments to Eleanor. $2,000 deposited into a separate account Henry knew nothing about. The payments continued for 24 years. That's nearly $600,000 in total. The number was staggering. I tried to process what it meant, what it said about the people involved. "It wasn't child support," Russell clarified. "It was hush money." Eleanor threatened to tell Paul's wife about the affair, threatened to destroy his marriage and his business reputation. Paul was trying to break into politics at the time, had aspirations of running for state senate. A scandal would have ruined him. Russell's expression darkened. "So he paid, and Eleanor collected." "How did Dad find out?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "He found a deposit slip Eleanor had carelessly left in her coat pocket. $2,000 from an account he didn't recognize. He hired a private investigator, and within a month he had the whole story. The affair, the payments, everything." Russell looked at me directly. In November 2010, Henry confronted Paul Anderson in person, told him the payments had to stop, that he wouldn't allow another man to pay for his daughter's existence, told Paul to stay away from this family, or he'd expose everything himself. I remembered 2010. I'd been 24, working my first real job after college. My father had seemed distracted, that fall distant. I'd attributed it to work stress. Now I knew better. "Paul complied immediately," Russell continued. "The payments stopped, but Eleanor was furious. She'd lost her secret income stream, and she blamed Henry for interfering. That's when their marriage truly ended, though they stayed together for appearances." He glanced at Eleanor with unconcealed disdain. "Eleanor never loved Paul. She used him, exploited his guilt and fear for her own financial gain, just like she used Henry for respectability and social status." The portrait Russell was painting of my mother was grotesque, but I couldn't deny its accuracy. Everything he described matched the woman I'd known my entire life. Calculating, manipulative, capable of weaponizing anything and anyone for her own benefit. "After Henry died and Eleanor changed the will, I started investigating Paul Anderson," Russell said. "I wanted to know if he had any legal claim to Henry's estate, if he might complicate probate. What I found was a man consumed by regret and guilt. a man who'd made terrible choices in his youth and had spent decades paying for them. Russell reached into his jacket pocket one more time and pulled out a business card, plain white with embossed black lettering. He held it out to me, and I took it with trembling fingers. Paul Anderson Anderson, Capital Management with a phone number and Columbus address. I contacted him 3 months ago, Russell said. Told him about Eleanor's theft, about the forged will, about how you'd been supporting this family in silence. He was horrified. He said he'd always wondered about you, always wanted to know if you were all right, but Henry's warning had kept him away. Russell's expression softened slightly. He asked if there was any way he could help, any way he could make amends for the damage his choices had caused. I stared at the business card, at the name that belonged to my biological father. A man I'd never met, never spoken to, never even thought about, because I hadn't known he existed beyond an abstract affair my mother had once had. Russell stood slowly, gathering his documents back into their folder with meticulous care. When he looked at me again, his eyes held something that might have been hope. Paul Anderson is still alive, Marissa, he said quietly, and he wants to meet you. 3 days after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself driving 40 minutes outside Columbus to a small diner Russell had suggested. The Bluebird Cafe sat at the edge of a truck stop, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. I'd barely slept since that night, my mind spinning through revelations and lies, trying to separate truth from manipulation after 38 years of not knowing which was which. I arrived 15 minutes early and ordered coffee I didn't drink, watching the parking lot through the window. At exactly 2 o'clock, a silver Mercedes pulled in, and an elderly man emerged. Even from a distance, I could see he moved carefully, like someone whose body had betrayed him. He was tall but stooped, wearing an expensive coat that hung a bit too loose on his frame. His hair was white thinning, and as he walked toward the diner entrance, I saw his hand shake slightly as he reached for the door handle. Paul Anderson looked nothing like me. That was my first thought when he stepped inside and our eyes met. His were blue, where mine were brown, his bone structure angular, where mine was softer. If I'd passed him on the street, I would never have guessed we shared DNA. He approached my booth, slowly clutching a worn leather briefcase against his chest like a shield. Marissa. His voice was rough, uncertain. Yes. I didn't stand up or offer my hand. I just watched him, this stranger who was apparently my father, and waited. May I sit? When I nodded, he lowered himself into the opposite seat with visible effort, setting the briefcase beside him. His hands were trembling. I know I have no right to be here. I know I failed you in every way a father can fail a child, but I needed to see you once before I die. He said it plainly, without drama. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say 6 months if I'm lucky. I felt something twist in my chest, though whether it was sympathy or anger I couldn't tell. I'm sorry. Don't be. He shook his head. I've had 68 years, and I wasted most of them being a coward. At least I get to do this one thing right before the end. He paused as a waitress approached, waved away her offer of coffee, waited until she left. I don't know where to start. Russell said you had an affair with my mother in 1986. Yes. He winced at the word affair like it physically hurt him. I was 30 years old, working in investment banking, trying to build something. I met Eleanor at a charity gala in February. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Sophisticated, charming, from this old Ohio family with history and connections I'd never had. He looked down at his hands. She told me her marriage was loveless, that Henry ignored her, that she felt trapped. I believed her because I wanted to, because she made me feel important in a way nobody else ever had. I said nothing, just let him talk. The affair lasted 6 months. We met in hotel rooms, out-of-town restaurants, places where nobody would recognize us. It felt exciting, forbidden. I thought I was in love. His laugh was bitter. In August, she told me she was pregnant. Said the baby was definitely mine because she and Henry hadn't been intimate in over a year. I panicked. I asked her to leave him to marry me, to let me raise my child properly. But she refused. She laughed in my face. Paul's voice was flat, emotionless now, like he was reciting facts from a script he'd memorized long ago. She said Henry's family name and money were too valuable to walk away from, that I was nice enough, but I didn't have the social standing she needed. I was just convenient. Someone to make her feel desired when her husband paid more attention to his business than to her. He met my eyes finally. Then she told me if I ever tried to contact her again, or tell anyone about the affair, she'd destroy me. Ruin my career, my reputation, everything. But she said if I sent money every month, she'd make sure the baby was taken care of, that my child would have everything she needed. So you paid? It wasn't a question. For 20 years. Paul reached for his briefcase and pulled out a thick accordion folder. $2,000 a month deposited into an account Eleanor specified. I have every bank record, every transaction. He spread them across the table, months and years of highlighted entries. From October 1986 to November 2010. That's $480,000. I stared at the numbers, trying to comprehend that amount of money. Nearly $500,000 sent to my mother, supposedly for me. Eleanor sent me updates every few months. Paul continued, pulling out a smaller stack of papers. Letters telling me how you were doing. She said the money was going to your education, your healthcare, saving for your college fund. She sent report cards, school photos. I have every one of them. His voice cracked slightly. I thought I was being a responsible father from afar. I thought I was doing the right thing even though I couldn't be there in person. He slid one of the photos across the table. I recognized it immediately. 5th grade school picture, my hair in braids, wearing a blue sweater my father had bought me. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, Marissa, age 10, doing well in school. Thank you for your continued support. I had no idea she was treating you the way Russell described, Paul said, and there were tears in his eyes now. I had no idea she was pocketing that money for herself while you struggled. If I'd known, I would have stopped the payments. I would have contacted Henry, would have done something, anything. But you didn't know because you never checked. The words came out harsher than I'd intended. You sent money to ease your guilt, and assumed that was enough. You're right. He didn't try to defend himself. I was a coward. I took the easy path, the one that let me pretend I was a decent person while avoiding any real responsibility. And you paid the price for my cowardice. We sat in silence for a long moment. The diner's ambient noise, clinking dishes, and distant conversations felt very far away. Paul took a shaky breath and pulled one more document from his briefcase. This one looked official, printed on legal letterhead. There's something else, he said quietly. Something I only discovered recently when I started going through Eleanor's financial history with Russell's help. He slid the paper across the table toward me. This is what Eleanor did with some of my money. And it involves your father's death. My hand trembled as I picked up the document. It was an insurance application from Mutual Life Trust Company dated November 2018. The policyholder name jumped out at me immediately. Eleanor Marie Cole. The insured, Henry James Cole. The death benefit amount made my breath catch $2 million. She took out life insurance on Dad. I looked up at Paul, trying to understand what I was seeing. Is that even legal? Spouses can insure each other, yes. It's common for estate planning. Paul's finger traced down to a section marked, Insured's Signature. But look at this signature. I'd seen my father's signature thousands of times. On birthday cards, permission slips, checks he'd written me for college textbooks. The signature on this insurance application was similar, but wrong in subtle ways. The H had too much flourish. The final E in Cole trailed off differently than my father's usual crisp ending. She forged it, I whispered. I believe so. And this section here, where it asks about pre-existing medical conditions. Paul pointed to a checked box marked No. Henry had documented heart disease. He'd been seeing a cardiologist since 2016. He was on 3 different medications. Eleanor claimed he was in perfect health. I set the paper down, my mind racing. How did you get this? Eleanor and I met occasionally over the years, usually when she needed additional money beyond the monthly payments. She'd call, we'd meet at my office, I'd write her a check. Paul's voice was heavy with regret. In September 2018, she came by asking for $20,000. Said it was for repairs on the house. I wrote the check and she left some papers on my desk by accident. This application was among them. Did you confront her? I did. Called her that same evening. Paul's jaw tightened. She laughed. She actually laughed and told me I was being paranoid. Said it was just standard financial planning that married couples insure each other all the time. She said Henry knew all about it, that they'd discussed it with their estate lawyer. He paused, pain evident on his face. I wanted to believe her. It was easier than believing the alternative. I picked up the document again, studying the date. November 2018. When did Dad die? February 7th, 2019, 14 months later. The number felt significant, though I couldn't immediately grasp why. Is that unusual? Life insurance companies have what's called a contestability period, Paul explained. Usually 2 years from when the policy is issued. During that time, if the insured dies, the company investigates thoroughly. They check medical records, interview doctors, look for any evidence of fraud. After 2 years, they typically pay out without much scrutiny. He met my eyes. Eleanor waited almost long enough to avoid that investigation. Another 10 months and there would have been no questions asked. A chill ran through me despite the diner's stuffy warmth. What was the official cause of death? Acute heart failure. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Richard Morrison, Henry's primary care physician. Paul pulled another paper from his folder, this one a copy of my father's death certificate. No autopsy was performed. At 69, with a documented history of heart disease, sudden cardiac death wasn't considered suspicious. I stared at the certificate, at my father's name printed in official typeface, at the date that had split my life into before and after. I'd been at work when I got the call. My mother's voice on the phone oddly calm, telling me Henry had passed peacefully in his sleep. I'd driven to the house in a fog, found my father in his bed, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The funeral home had come quickly. Everything had been handled with such efficiency that I barely had time to process what had happened. Russell started suspecting something was wrong at the funeral, Paul continued. He said Eleanor showed no emotion. Not grief, not sadness, nothing. She stood by the casket accepting condolences like she was hosting a garden party. I remembered that too. How composed she'd been, how perfectly she'd played the grieving widow while I'd fallen apart. I'd attributed it to her being stronger than me, more controlled. Now I wondered if it was something else entirely. Within a week of the funeral, Eleanor was shopping, Paul said. Russell saw her at an antique store buying new furniture. By summer, she'd redecorated the entire house. New drapes, new carpets replaced the kitchen cabinets Henry had installed 10 years earlier. She bought herself a Mercedes, started taking expensive trips. She had the life insurance money, I said slowly, understanding dawning. $500,000 from Henry's existing policy, which was legitimate, and $2 million from this policy. Paul tapped the fraudulent application. $2.5 million plus whatever was left in Henry's accounts before she spent it all. Russell said when he saw how quickly Eleanor was burning through money, he started digging deeper. That's when he found this insurance policy in the probate records. And that's when he started wondering if Henry's death had been as natural as it appeared. The implication hung between us too terrible to speak aloud, yet impossible to ignore. My mother had taken out a massive life insurance policy on my father using forged documents. 14 months later, my father was dead. My mother had shown no grief and immediately spent a fortune. She'd forged his will, stolen my inheritance, and lied about everything for 5 years. I thought about my father's death, how sudden it had seemed even though his health had been declining, How the doctor had been so quick to sign the death certificate. How my mother had insisted on a closed casket on cremation, on handling everything so quickly that I barely had time to say goodbye. The doctor who signed the death certificate, I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant. Dr. Morrison, how long had he been treating Dad? About 3 years, I believe, since 2016. And Mom chose him. Found him. Paul's expression shifted, understanding where I was going. I don't know. Russell might. My hands were shaking so badly now that I had to press them flat against the table. The fluorescent lights of the diner suddenly seemed too bright, the air too thin. All these years I'd accepted my father's death as tragic but natural. A sick man whose heart finally gave out. I'd mourned him, missed him, but never questioned the circumstances. Now every detail seemed sinister. The timing, the insurance policy, my mother's lack of grief, the quick cremation that destroyed any evidence, the doctor who certified death without question. I looked up at Paul and I saw my own horror reflected in his eyes. Are you saying Mom killed Dad? The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they felt like shouting in the quiet diner. Paul couldn't answer my question with certainty, but the suspicion had taken root, and I couldn't let it go. I left the diner with copies of all his documents and spent the next week barely sleeping, barely eating, consumed by the need to know the truth. Russell connected me with a private investigator named Marcus Chen, a former police detective who specialized in cold cases. I gave him everything: the insurance documents, the death certificate, Dr. Morrison's name, and the date my father died. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me. I found something. A nurse who worked at Ohio Valley Hospital in early 2019. She left the state suddenly in March of that year, right after your father's death. Took a job in Arizona and hasn't been back since. His voice was careful, measured. Her name is Sarah Collins. She was on duty the night your father died. It took 3 days of phone calls before Sarah agreed to meet me. She wouldn't come to Ohio, wouldn't even video chat. Finally, she agreed to meet halfway at a coffee shop in Indianapolis. 1 hour, she said. That's all I can give you. I drove the 2 hours, barely aware of the road, my mind spinning through possibilities I didn't want to believe. The coffee shop was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people worked on laptops, and nobody paid attention to anyone else's conversations. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting in a back corner booth, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. She was 52, according to Marcus's background check, but she looked older. Tired. Her brown hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore scrubs, even though it was her day off, like she'd come straight from a shift, or maybe just felt more comfortable in uniform. Marissa. She stood slightly when I approached, her eyes searching my face. You look like him. Your father. Around the eyes. I slid into the booth across from her. Thank you for meeting me. I almost didn't come. Sarah's voice was quiet, raw. I've spent 5 years trying to forget that night. But when your investigator said Henry Cole's daughter was looking for answers, I knew I couldn't run anymore. She took a shaky breath. I've been carrying this guilt since February 2019. It's been eating me alive. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What happened that night? Sarah's hands tightened around her mug. Your father was admitted to Ohio Valley Hospital on February 11th with chest pains. Minor episode, nothing life-threatening. We stabilized him, got his medications adjusted, and he was doing well. Comfortable. He was supposed to be discharged within 48 hours. She paused, her eyes distant, seeing something I couldn't. I was working the night shift 11 to 7. Your father was one of 6 patients on my floor. Around 10:30 he was sleeping peacefully. All his vitals were good. I checked on him before I took my break. What changed? Dr. Morrison showed up at 11 o'clock. Sarah's voice had dropped almost to a whisper. It wasn't unusual for doctors to make evening rounds, but Morrison rarely did. He was more of a 9-to-5 physician. But there he was in the hallway, outside your father's room with a chart in his hand, and this look on his face I couldn't quite read. I leaned forward, not wanting to miss a word. He called me over and showed me new orders for your father's medication. Digoxin, a heart medication your father had been taking for years. But the dosage Morrison ordered was wrong. Double what your father usually received. I questioned it immediately. Sarah's eyes met mine, and I saw shame there and fear. I said, "Doctor, this dosage seems very high for his current condition. Are you sure?" And he snapped at me. Told me he was the doctor, that he knew what he was doing, that I should do my job and stop questioning his orders. But you knew it was wrong. I knew it was high, possibly dangerous. Sarah's voice cracked. But I was a nurse and he was a doctor. I'd been written up twice that year for minor infractions, nothing serious, but I was on thin ice with administration. I couldn't afford to lose my job. I had 2 kids in college and a mortgage, so I did what he ordered. Tears were sliding down her cheeks now. I administered the medication at 11:15. Your father woke up, briefly asked for water. I gave it to him. He seemed fine. The coffee shop noise faded away. There was only Sarah's voice, only the story she'd been holding for 5 years. By 1 o'clock, his heart rate had increased. By 2, he was in distress. I called Dr. Morrison and he came back, but he seemed to take his time getting there. When he finally arrived, your father was in full cardiac arrest. We tried to resuscitate him, but his heart was too damaged. He was pronounced dead at 2:47 in the morning. Sarah wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. I knew. Even then, I knew something was wrong. The timing, the medication, Morrison's behavior. But I was terrified. What happened after? I filed my report standard procedure, documented everything including the medication I'd given and when. 2 days later, Dr. Morrison called me into his private office. Not the hospital, his personal practice office downtown. Sarah's hands were shaking now. He closed the door and sat across from me with this envelope. He told me he appreciated my professionalism during a difficult situation. Said sometimes patients die despite our best efforts, that it was nobody's fault. Then he slid the envelope across the desk. What was in it? $10,000 in cash, and a reference letter for a position at a hospital in Phoenix, already arranged, already approved. He said I was a talented nurse and deserved a fresh start somewhere new. Sarah's voice had gone flat. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat disguised as kindness. He was telling me to take the money, take the job, and keep my mouth shut about what happened that night. And you took it. I took it. The shame in her voice was crushing. I took the money and I left Ohio 3 weeks later. I told myself your father would have died anyway, that his heart was already weak, that I was just following orders. I tried to convince myself I hadn't done anything wrong. She looked up at me, her eyes red and desperate. But I had. I knew that medication was wrong. I should have refused. I should have called another doctor, gone to a supervisor, done something. Instead, I gave your father the dose that killed him because I was afraid of losing my job. I sat frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. My father hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been murdered, deliberately poisoned by a doctor who was supposed to heal him. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder worn at the edges from years of handling. She set it on the table between us. I kept copies of everything, she said quietly. The original medication, orders, the dosage records, the timeline of events that night, my nursing notes. I told myself it was just to cover myself legally if questions ever came up. But really, I think I kept them because I knew one day someone would come asking. Someone who deserved the truth. She pushed the folder toward me. Dr. Morrison killed your father, Marissa, and I helped him do it. Sarah's folder contained everything I needed to prove medical malpractice, but it didn't answer the question that burned in my mind. Why would Dr. Morrison risk his career and his freedom to kill a patient? Russell helped me track him down through medical licensing boards and old hospital records. Richard Morrison had retired abruptly in January 2020, less than a year after my father's death. He'd moved from Columbus to a small apartment building in Cleveland, no forwarding address left with former colleagues, no trace on social media. We found his apartment on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The building was nothing like what I'd expected for a successful physician. 4 stories, aging brick, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Russell knocked on apartment 2C while I stood slightly behind him, my heart racing. The door opened a crack, security chains still attached. Morrison's face appeared in the gap, older than the photo I'd found online, unshaven, his eyes bloodshot and suspicious. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." "Dr. Morrison, my name is Marissa Cole. Henry Cole was my father." The door slammed shut so fast I flinched. I heard the deadbolt turn, heard footsteps retreating into the apartment. Russell looked at me. "Now what?" I pulled out the note I'd written that morning, folded it carefully, and slid it under the door. On it, I'd written only one sentence. "Eleanor betrayed you too. Let's talk." We waited in Russell's car for an hour, parked across the street where we could see Morrison's window. I was about to give up when my phone rang, a Cleveland area code I didn't recognize. "How did you know?" Morrison's voice was rough, slurred slightly. He'd been drinking. "Because she betrays everyone eventually. Can we meet?" There was a long silence then. "Riverside Park. 1 hour. Come alone." Russell insisted on staying nearby, watching from a distance, but I approached Morrison by myself. He sat on a bench overlooking the Cuyahoga River, wearing a wrinkled shirt and old jeans, looking nothing like the confident doctor I'd seen in photographs from his practice. Up close, I could see how much he'd deteriorated. His hands shook when he lit a cigarette, and there was a half-empty bottle of whiskey barely concealed in a paper bag beside him. "You look like Henry," he said without looking at me. "Same eyes. He was a good man. Better than me." I sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving space between us. "Tell me what happened." Morrison took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling smoke that the wind carried away. "I met Eleanor in 2016. Henry came in for a cardiology referral and she accompanied him to the appointment. She was beautiful, charming, and she paid attention to me in a way my ex-wife never had." He laughed bitterly. "I was 57, divorced, lonely, and she made me feel like I mattered. We started having coffee after Henry's appointments. Then lunch. Then more." "You had an affair." "I fell in love. Or what I thought was love." Morrison's voice cracked. "She told me her marriage was cold, that Henry was emotionally distant, that she'd wasted her life with a man who didn't appreciate her. She said she'd leave him, that we'd be together, but she needed time." He took another drink from the bottle. "For 2 years we met in hotel rooms at my apartment, anywhere Henry wouldn't find out. She made me promises, made me believe in a future that never existed." "When did she ask you to kill him?" Morrison flinched at the word kill, but he didn't deny it. "Late 2018. She'd already taken out the insurance policy. She showed me the paperwork one night after we'd been together. Said it was just smart planning, but I could see what she was thinking even before she said it out loud." He stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "She started slowly. Asked hypothetical questions. What medications could cause heart problems? How someone with existing cardiac issues might deteriorate naturally. Then one night she looked at me and said, 'Henry is suffering. His heart is failing. It would be a mercy to let him go peacefully rather than watching him decline for years.' The manipulation was so clear, so calculated. I felt sick. She researched everything," Morrison continued. "Spent weeks learning about beta blockers, about dosage levels, about how to trigger fatal arrhythmia in a heart patient. She told me exactly what to do. Said it would look completely natural, that no one would question a 69-year-old man with documented heart disease dying in his sleep." His hands were shaking violently now. "She even practiced forging Henry's signature on documents. showed me how good she'd gotten at it, laughed about how easy it was to fool people. And you agreed to do it. She said we'd split the insurance money, $2 million. She said we'd move to Florida, buy a house on the beach, start over somewhere nobody knew us. Morrison's voice broke completely. She said she loved me, that I was the only man who'd ever truly understood her. I believed every word. What happened after my father died? For about 3 weeks, she played the grieving widow perfectly. We'd meet in secret and she'd tell me how hard it was to pretend to be sad, how she couldn't wait until enough time had passed that we could be together publicly. Morrison drank directly from the bottle now, not bothering with pretense. The insurance money came through in April, $2 million plus the $500,000 from Henry's old policy. I asked when we'd move to Florida. She said soon, we just had to be careful, had to wait a respectable amount of time. But she never planned to leave with you. By June, she'd stopped answering my calls, blocked my number. I went to the house once and she threatened to call the police. Said if I ever contacted her again, she'd tell everyone I'd killed Henry without her knowledge. That she had evidence I'd acted alone, that she could prove I was obsessed with her and murdered her husband to try to be with her. Morrison's laugh was hollow, broken. She'd been planning that narrative all along, had fake journal entries about how uncomfortable I made her feel, texts she'd sent to friends claiming I was inappropriate. She'd set me up perfectly. I sat in stunned silence watching this ruined man who'd destroyed my father and himself for a woman who'd never cared about either of them. She used me exactly the way she used Paul Anderson, Morrison said quietly. Took what she needed and threw me away. I lost my medical license, lost my practice, lost everything. I sit in that apartment every day knowing I murdered a good man for nothing. He turned to look at me finally, his eyes red and desperate. I'll testify against her. I'll tell everything to the police, to lawyers, to whoever will listen. I have nothing left to lose. Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, an older model with a cracked screen. Before Eleanor cut me off completely, I recorded one of our last conversations. I was getting suspicious, starting to realize she was pulling away. I thought if I had evidence of our relationship, she couldn't just abandon me. He pulled up an audio file and held the phone out to me. You need to hear this. Morrison's hand trembled as he pressed play on the audio file. The recording quality was rough, like it had been captured on a phone hidden in a pocket, but the voices were unmistakable. My mother's voice came through first clear and cold. You did exactly what I asked, Richard. Poor Henry never knew what hit him. Morrison's voice responded, desperate, needy. When can I see you again, Eleanor? It's been 2 weeks. A laugh. My mother's laugh, but with an edge I'd never heard before. Cruel. Satisfied. Let's give it a few months, darling. We need to be careful. People are watching. The insurance company might ask questions if the grieving widow suddenly has a new boyfriend. I miss you. I know. But we have to be smart about this. We're almost there. The insurance check should clear by mid-April. Then we just need to wait a respectable amount of time before we can be together openly. 6 months, like you said. Then we move to Florida. Something like that. We'll see how things develop. There was a pause, the sound of ice clinking in a glass. The important thing is that everything went perfectly. The plan worked exactly as we discussed. No one suspects anything. Morrison's voice dropped lower. I still can't believe we actually did it. Oh, don't get sentimental on me now, Richard. My mother's tone was sharp, impatient. Henry was dying anyway. We just accelerated the inevitable, and now we're both free. You're sure no one will figure it out? How could they? You certified the death as natural causes. There was no autopsy. Henry was 69 with documented heart disease. Even if someone wanted to investigate, there's nothing to find. He's already been cremated. Another pause. You worry too much. That's why I handle the planning and you handle the medical side. We each do what we're good at. The recording continued for another 6 minutes, my mother's voice growing increasingly cold. As Morrison pressed her for reassurance and affection she clearly had no intention of giving. By the end, she was making excuses to hang up, claiming she had an appointment she couldn't miss. Morrison stopped the recording and looked at me with hollow eyes. That was March 23rd, the last real conversation we had before she cut me off completely. I sat frozen on this park bench, my mother's words echoing in my head. Poor Henry never knew what hit him. The plan worked exactly as we discussed. She'd said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, like they'd been discussing a business transaction instead of murder. I need copies of everything, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The recording, your medical records from that night, anything that proves what you just told me. Morrison nodded. I'll send it all. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to ask. Russell and I spent the next 2 days organizing evidence into a timeline that would hold up under scrutiny. We needed help from someone who understood criminal procedure, someone who could guide us through the legal maze ahead. Russell suggested Calvin Moore, a retired detective who'd worked major crimes for Columbus PD for 28 years. Calvin had been friends with my father, had attended his funeral, and had apparently remarked to Russell at the time that Eleanor's behavior seemed off. We met Calvin at his home office, a converted garage filled with filing cabinets and whiteboards from old cases he'd never quite let go. He was 64, barrel-chested, with sharp eyes that took in every detail as Russell and I laid out everything we'd discovered. The forged will, the fraudulent insurance policy, Sarah Collins's testimony about the medication, Morrison's confession, the recording of my mother admitting to conspiracy. Calvin listened to the entire recording twice, taking notes in a shorthand I couldn't decipher. When it finished the second time, he sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "This is enough for murder conspiracy charges," he said finally. "With Morrison willing to testify and the nurse backing up the medical malpractice, you've got a solid case." He tapped his pen against his notepad. "But here's the problem. A defense attorney will argue Morrison is lying to save himself, that he acted alone and is trying to shift blame to Eleanor. They'll say he recorded this conversation and scripted Eleanor's lines or edited it somehow. Without Eleanor actually confessing directly on record with no way to claim coercion, it's going to be his word against hers." "What do we need?" I asked. "We need Eleanor to confess in a situation where she thinks she's safe, where she's comfortable and not expecting to be recorded." Calvin leaned forward. "You need to get her talking. Get her to admit what she did, thinking no one but you will ever hear it." An idea had been forming in my mind since I'd heard Morrison's recording something risky but potentially devastating. What if I invite her to dinner? Tell her I want to reconcile, that I'm willing to forget about the will dispute if we can just move forward as a family. Russell's eyebrows shot up. "She'd never believe that." "She might," I said slowly, thinking it through. "She's arrogant. She thinks she's smarter than everyone else, that she's gotten away with everything. If I play the defeated daughter, the one who's tired of fighting and just wants peace, she'll come. She won't be able to resist the opportunity to gloat." Calvin was nodding slowly. "You'd need to record it. Multiple cameras, audio backups, everything time-stamped and authenticated so it can't be challenged in court." "I can set that up," Russell said. "I know people who do corporate security installations. We can make Marissa's apartment a recording studio without Eleanor knowing." "There's something else," I said, an idea crystallizing. "What if we don't just record it for evidence? What if we broadcast it live so Eleanor can't claim the recording was edited or manipulated?" Both men stared at me. "How?" Calvin asked. "My mother is in a church social media group. About 40 women from her congregation, very active on Facebook. They live stream their prayer meetings and charity events." I pulled out my phone and showed them my mother's Facebook page, the endless posts about her charitable work and church activities. What if the live stream accidentally gets turned on during our dinner conversation, just a technical error? No one's fault. Russell's face had gone very still. "That would destroy her publicly, not just legally but socially. Everything she's built, her reputation, her standing in the community." "Yes," I said simply. "It would." Calvin studied me carefully. "Once this goes public, there's no walking it back. Your family will be headline news. Every detail will be picked apart. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my father, about his kindness and his quiet strength. about how my mother had used him, betrayed him, and ultimately killed him. About the 5 years I'd spent supporting the woman who'd murdered him, believing I was doing the right thing. "I'm prepared," I said. 2 days later, I stood in my small apartment arranging hidden cameras behind picture frames and inside decorative objects, while Russell supervised the technical setup. There were 3 cameras with different angles, all feeding to a cloud server that would preserve the footage, even if the physical devices were discovered and destroyed. The audio was even more sophisticated, multiple microphones hidden throughout the living room and dining area. Russell finished programming the final camera and turned to me. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once this goes public, there's no going back. Your mother will be arrested. Your family will never be the same." I looked around my modest apartment at the life I'd built independently from my family's money and influence, at the strength I'd developed through years of being dismissed and underestimated. "There's already no going back," I said quietly. "The moment she murdered my father, she destroyed this family. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth." The dinner was set for Friday evening at 7 o'clock. I'd spent the afternoon cooking something simple my father used to love: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The apartment smelled like home in a way it rarely did, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I was preparing a meal to trap the woman who'd killed the man who taught me how to cook. My laptop sat open on the side table near the dining area, angled so the camera captured the table perfectly. I'd logged into the St. Augustine Prayer Circle Facebook group an hour earlier, the private group my mother had been part of for 15 years. She was one of the most active members, always posting prayer requests and inspirational quotes about family values and Christian duty. 347 members, mostly women from the church and surrounding community people who knew my mother as the devoted widow, the faithful servant, the pillar of respectability. I clicked the Go Live button and muted the notifications, positioning the screen so it looked like I'd simply left my computer open by accident. To anyone watching, it would appear to be a mundane view of an empty dining room. The view count started at 0. The doorbell rang at 7 sharp. My mother believed punctuality was a virtue even when she was coming to manipulate her daughter. Eleanor swept in wearing a cream cashmere sweater and tailored pants, looking every inch the elegant matriarch. Lydia followed, visibly nervous, her eyes darting around my small apartment like she was searching for exits. Since Thanksgiving, Lydia and I had spoken twice. She was terrified of our mother, but not yet ready to break free entirely. "Marissa, dear, this is lovely," Eleanor said, surveying the table with an expression that suggested she found nothing lovely about it at all. "So quaint." We sat down to eat, and I played my role perfectly. The defeated daughter, exhausted from fighting, ready to wave the white flag. "I've been thinking about everything that happened at Thanksgiving," I said, passing the potatoes. "Maybe I overreacted. Family is more important than money or property." Eleanor's eyes sharpened with interest, but she kept her voice sympathetic. "I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. The stress of that evening was difficult for all of us." Behind her, I could see my laptop screen. The view count had climbed to 47. People were starting to notice the live stream, probably wondering why Eleanor Cole's daughter had accidentally broadcast an empty room. "I do have some questions, though," I continued carefully, "just so I can understand and move forward. Dad's will that Russell showed us at Thanksgiving, the one from 2015. Why did you change it?" Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I didn't change anything. Your father revised his will before he died. He was of sound mind and made his choices. But the signatures don't match Mom. Anyone can see that. Signatures change when people are ill." Eleanor's voice had an edge now. "You're not going to start this again, are you? I thought we were here to reconcile." Lydia was barely eating, her eyes moving between us like she was watching a tennis match. "I just want to understand," I pressed. "Dad left me the house and the business in 2015. Why would he suddenly change his mind 4 years later and leave everything to you instead?" Eleanor set down her fork with a sharp clink. "Because your father was a weak man who didn't understand how the world actually works. He thought love and good intentions were enough to run a household to maintain a family's standing. He had no practical sense whatsoever. The view count was at 132. Comments were starting to appear in the chat, but I couldn't read them from where I sat. So you changed it because you knew better. I kept my voice neutral, curious rather than accusatory. I changed it because that money was mine. I earned it by putting up with Henry Cole for 30 years, by hosting his tedious dinner parties and pretending to care about his boring business associates and raising his children. She reached for her wine glass, took a long drink. Children. That's rich. You were never even his real daughter. Lydia gasped softly, but Eleanor ignored her. You were Paul Anderson's mistake. Eleanor continued, her words flowing faster now, fueled by wine and years of suppressed contempt. A reminder of one meaningless affair I had when I was bored. And Lydia, well, she was always easier to control, more pliable. But Henry, foolish Henry, loved you more than his actual daughter. It was pathetic. The view count had passed 200. I could see the comment section exploding with activity, a rapid scroll of shocked reactions. So you forged his signature, I said quietly. He was dying anyway. Eleanor's voice rose, her composure finally cracking. Lying there in that hospital bed, weak and pathetic, barely able to speak. What did it matter what some old will said? He wouldn't need that money where he was going. You mean after you had Dr. Morrison kill him? The words dropped like a bomb. Eleanor's face went completely white, then flushed deep red. What did you just say? I know about Richard Morrison, about your affair, about the plan to increase Dad's medication until his heart gave out. I kept my voice steady, clinical. I know you promised to split the insurance money with him and then cut him off once you had what you wanted. Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping back. You have no idea what you're talking about. This is insane. I have recordings, Mom. Morrison kept everything. And Nurse Collins, the one you paid to leave town, she kept records too. You're bluffing. But Eleanor's voice shook. Am I? Morrison told me everything. How you planned it for months. How you researched which medications would trigger heart failure. How you told him Henry was suffering and it would be a mercy. I stood too, facing her across the table. You murdered Dad for $2 million in insurance money, and you made his doctor believe you loved him so he'd help you do it. Eleanor's laugh was shrill, desperate. Even if any of that were true, which it isn't, you have no proof. Morrison is a disgraced drunk who'd say anything. That nurse was paid off years ago. There's nothing you can do. Actually, I said quietly, everyone already knows. What? Lydia had noticed the laptop screen. She'd moved closer to it while Eleanor and I fought, and now she could see the view counter, 312 people watching. She could see the comments flooding past, hundreds of them, expressions of shock and horror and demands to call the police. Mom! Lydia's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Mom, we're live, the whole church is watching. Eleanor's face cycled through emotions so quickly, I could barely track them. Shock, rage, fear, and finally something like animal panic. She lunged for my laptop, but I was faster, slamming it shut and holding it against my chest. The damage was already done anyway. 312 people had watched her confession in real time, and that number was growing by the second as viewers shared the stream. My phone started buzzing incessantly. Text messages, Facebook notifications, missed calls, all flooding in simultaneously. Eleanor's phone was doing the same thing, vibrating so violently on the table that it nearly fell off the edge. Turn it off, Eleanor hissed at me. Turn it off, right now. It's already over, Mom. Everyone saw. Everyone heard. Lydia had sunk back into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Eleanor rounded on her with fury. Stop that crying! Get up! We're leaving right now! But before either of them could move, there was a knock at my door, then another, then several at once, urgent and insistent. I opened it to find Pastor John from St. Augustine still in his Friday evening casual clothes, his face stricken and pale. Behind him were at least a dozen church members, more arriving by the minute, filling the hallway of my apartment building. Marissa, Pastor John said, his voice shaking. Tell me what we just saw wasn't real. Tell me it was some kind of joke or misunderstanding." Eleanor pushed past me, trying to reach the door, but the pastor stepped inside and the crowd behind him filled the doorway. "Eleanor, how could you? Henry was one of our most faithful members. He supported this church for 40 years and you—" His voice broke completely. "How could you do this? This is a private family matter," Eleanor said, but her voice had lost all its authority. "You have no right to be here." "We have every right." The voice came from Margaret Chen, a woman in her 70s who'd been in my mother's Bible study group for 2 decades. "You stood in front of our congregation and gave testimony about Christian values. You led prayer circles about honesty and devotion. And all the while you'd murdered your husband and stolen from your own daughter." My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I glanced at the screen and saw the live stream had been shared over 500 times. Screenshots of my mother's face frozen in moments of confession were already circulating with captions. The local Columbus News Facebook pages had picked it up. This was going viral in real time. Someone in the crowd had called the police. I heard sirens before I saw the flashing lights through my window. 2 officers arrived, then 4, then 6, as the crowd in the hallway grew larger and more agitated. One officer, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, gently moved people aside and entered my apartment. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Linda Santos. We've received multiple calls about a disturbance and a possible confession to a crime. Can you tell me what's happening here?" I handed her my laptop. "Everything you need is on there. The live stream recording saved automatically to the cloud. My mother just confessed to murdering my father." Eleanor made one last desperate attempt at control. "This is all a misunderstanding. My daughter is mentally unstable. She's been harassing me for months. She set this whole thing up." "Mom, stop!" Lydia's voice cut through the chaos stronger than I'd ever heard it. "Just stop, please. No more lies." Eleanor turned to her betrayal written across her face. "Lydia, we need to leave. Now. These people don't understand. I'm not going anywhere with you." Lydia stood up, wiping tears from her face. "I can't do this anymore. I can't watch you destroy everything and everyone around you." That's when Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. She clutched at her chest, her breathing coming in rapid, shallow gasps. "I can't breathe, I can't." She collapsed into a chair, her face going gray. The paramedics arrived within minutes, called by someone in the crowd who'd seen her distress. They checked her vitals, asked questions she couldn't answer coherently, and made the decision to transport her to the hospital. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, Eleanor's eyes found mine, and in them I saw pure hatred mixed with something that might have been fear. The police followed the ambulance to the hospital, one officer staying behind to take my statement and collect evidence. By midnight, my small apartment had finally emptied, though the hallway outside still buzzed with activity. News vans had arrived. Reporters were trying to get into the building. My phone had received over 200 messages. I sat on my couch with Lydia beside me, both of us exhausted beyond words. She'd been crying on and off for hours, and when she finally spoke, her voice was raw and small. "I'm so sorry, Marissa, for everything. For laughing at you, for not standing up for you, for being too afraid to see what she really was." Lydia took my hand, squeezed it tight. "I should have protected you. You're my sister, and I should have been on your side all along." And I squeezed back, and for the first time in our lives, we weren't rivals or strangers forced together by biology. We were just 2 women who'd survived the same monster wearing different masks. "We can start over," I said quietly. "Both of us." My phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Then another. Then dozens more, all from women I'd never met. "You're so brave for speaking up. My mother did the same thing to me. Thank you for showing us we don't have to accept abuse. You saved my life tonight by giving me the courage to leave." The local news alert popped up on my phone. "Prominent Ohio socialite accused of murder plot confession goes viral." Below it was a screenshot of my mother's face twisted in rage with the caption of her own words. "He was dying anyway. I just sped things along. By morning, the story had spread beyond Columbus. State news picked it up, then national outlets. My mother's confession had been viewed over 50,000 times. Russell called at 7 in the morning, his voice urgent. "Marissa, I just heard from Calvin Moore. The police got a warrant to search your mother's house last night. They went through everything top to bottom." He paused and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "They found something in the basement. You need to get down to the station right now." Russell met me in the parking lot of the police station, his face grave. "Calvin wanted us to see this before they formally enter it into evidence. What they found changes everything." Inside, Calvin led us to a conference room where evidence boxes were stacked on a long table, each labeled and photographed. "The search warrant was executed at 6 this morning," he explained. "Your mother's house top to bottom. Most of it was what we expected financial records correspondence. But there was a door in the basement locked with a deadbolt. We found the key in Eleanor's bedroom, hidden inside a jewelry box." He opened his laptop and pulled up crime scene photographs. The basement room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet with no windows. File cabinets lined 2 walls. A small desk sat in the corner with a reading lamp. It looked like a secret office, a place where Eleanor could work without anyone knowing what she was doing. "We found 3 filing cabinets full of documents," Calvin continued, clicking through photos. "Every financial transaction with Paul Anderson going back to 1986. Bank statements, deposit slips, even copies of the threatening letters she sent him when he tried to stop paying." He pulled up an image of a handwritten letter on Eleanor's personal stationery. "This one's from 2009. She threatens to tell his wife and destroy his political career if he doesn't increase the monthly payments to $3,000. Russell leaned forward, studying the image. She kept evidence of her own blackmail. Insurance policy, probably. If Paul ever tried to expose her, she could claim he was a willing participant, show that he'd been paying her for decades. Make it look like a consensual arrangement gone wrong. Calvin clicked to the next photo. But that's not the worst of it. The image showed another filing cabinet, this one dedicated entirely to Dr. Richard Morrison. Love letters, explicit photographs, hotel receipts. Eleanor had documented their entire affair with the thoroughness of someone building a case file. She kept records of everything Morrison told her, Calvin said. Medical details about Henry's condition, notes about which medications could cause complications. And then there's this. He pulled up a photograph of a leather-bound notebook, the pages filled with Eleanor's neat handwriting. One entry was highlighted. Morrison agreed. February timing. Dosage 2x normal beta blocker. Funeral arrangements by end of month. I felt sick looking at it. My mother had planned my father's murder with the same methodical attention she'd given to planning dinner parties. The forensic accountant found something else, Calvin said, pulling out a printed spreadsheet. The life insurance policy on Henry wasn't the first one Eleanor had taken out on a family member. In 1994, she insured Henry's mother for $200,000. The grandmother died in 1995 of pneumonia that went untreated. I remember that, Russell said quietly. Margaret Cole. She was 72 in relatively good health. She got sick in November and was gone by Christmas. It seemed sudden, but she was elderly, so no one questioned it. Calvin pulled up copies of letters, old yellowed pages that had been carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. We found correspondence between Eleanor and Margaret from October 1995. Margaret writes that she's feeling ill, that she thinks she should see a doctor. Eleanor's response advises against it, says doctors overreact to common colds in elderly patients, that rest and home remedies are better. Margaret trusted her daughter-in-law and didn't seek treatment. By the time Henry realized how sick she was and insisted on calling a doctor, the pneumonia had progressed to sepsis. Eleanor killed her too, I whispered. There's no way to prove it conclusively after this many years, but the pattern is clear. Margaret dies. Eleanor collects $150,000 in insurance money, plus a substantial inheritance. 24 years later, Henry dies. Eleanor collects $2.5 million. Calvin paused, his expression darkening further. But there's one more thing. We found a marriage certificate from 1982. Eleanor was married before Henry to a man named Thomas Hartwell. The name was vaguely familiar. Her sister is Catherine Hartwell. Thomas was Catherine's brother. He died in 1984, 2 years into the marriage. Accidental fall down the stairs in their home. Eleanor was the only witness. She claimed he'd been drinking, lost his balance. There was a life insurance policy, small, only $50,000, but significant for a 26-year-old woman in 1984. Russell had gone completely pale. "You're saying Eleanor has been doing this for 40 years? "I'm saying the evidence suggests a pattern of behavior. Whether we can prosecute for crimes that old is another question, but it establishes a history." Calvin closed the laptop and looked at me directly. "Your mother is a serial killer, Marissa. She's been murdering people for insurance money since before you were born." The words should have shocked me more than they did, but after everything I'd learned, they almost made sense. Eleanor had never been just cruel or manipulative. She'd been calculating, predatory, willing to kill anyone who stood between her and what she wanted. "There's one more thing," Russell said quietly. He pulled a plastic evidence bag from one of the boxes. Inside was a cream-colored envelope, the paper aged and slightly yellowed. My name was written on the front in my father's careful handwriting. The date written below it made my breath catch, January 30th, 2019, 1 week before he died. "We found this in a locked drawer in Eleanor's desk," Russell said. "She'd kept it all these years, never gave it to you." Calvin carefully opened the evidence bag and used gloved hands to extract the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of my father's personal stationery covered in his handwriting. Calvin held it so I could read it, his expression somber. "To my daughter," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and Eleanor is to blame." Calvin made a copy of the letter for evidence purposes, but he allowed Russell to bring the original to my apartment that evening. I'd returned home after hours at the police station, exhausted and hollowed out, feeling like I'd lived a year in the span of 2 days. Lydia had gone to stay with our Aunt Patricia, needing distance from everything that had happened. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty. Russell arrived at 8 o'clock, carrying the envelope with the care of someone transporting something sacred. He didn't say anything when I opened the door, just handed it to me, and followed me to the couch where we both sat down. My name on the envelope was written in my father's hand, slightly shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably his. The date below it felt like a countdown to death. January 30th, 2019. He'd written this one, week before he died. 1 week before my mother and Dr. Morrison had increased his medication and stopped his heart. My hands trembled so badly I could barely break the seal. Russell reached over and steadied my wrist, his touch gentle and grounding. The paper inside was thick, expensive, the kind my father had always used for important correspondence. I unfolded it carefully and began to read. "My dearest Marissa," it began, and seeing those words in his handwriting broke something open in my chest. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know Eleanor is planning to kill me. I've seen the insurance papers she thought she'd hidden. I've heard her late-night phone calls with Morrison speaking in low voices when she thinks I'm asleep. I know what's coming and I'm too weak to fight it anymore." I had to stop reading, had to breathe through the wave of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm me. Russell's hand found mine and held it. "The congestive heart failure would take me within months anyway," the letter continued. "The doctors have been honest about that. But I couldn't let Eleanor succeed in what she really wants, which is to erase you from my life, to rewrite our family history as if you never mattered, That's why I gave Russell the original will. That's why I'm writing this letter. I need you to know the truth even if I'm not there to tell you in person." My vision blurred with tears, but I kept reading. "You were never my blood, and I've known that since you were 3 years old. Eleanor confessed it during one of our worst fights, thinking it would hurt me, thinking it would make me love you less. But she didn't understand then, and she never will. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does, Choice does. From the moment you were born, you were mine. When you took your first steps and ran to me instead of Eleanor. When you learned to read and wanted to share every story. When you graduated high school with honors, and I saw the person you'd become. Every single moment you were my daughter. Not by accident of biology, but by the deliberate choice of two hearts that recognized each other. I was crying openly now, tears streaming down my face and dropping onto the paper. Russell's arm came around my shoulder, steadying me. "You have integrity that Eleanor will never understand," my father had written. "She sees love as weakness, as something to be exploited. You see it as strength, as something worth protecting even when it costs you. That's why I'm leaving everything to you. Not because you're more deserving than Lydia, but because I trust you to do right by her. Lydia is my biological daughter and I loved her deeply, but Eleanor made her weak through control and manipulation. She kept Lydia dependent because it served her purposes. You, she couldn't control, so she tried to destroy you instead. You survived because you're stronger than Eleanor ever gave you credit for." The letter continued in my father's careful script, his words growing slightly more uneven as his hand must have tired. "I kept evidence in Russell's care. He's been more than a business partner. He's the brother I never had, and I trust him with my life's work and with your future. He knows everything, and he's promised to protect you after I'm gone. Trust him the way I trusted him. Let him help you fight Eleanor when the time comes, because she will fight. She'll forge documents, she'll lie to anyone who'll listen, she'll try to make the world believe you were nothing to me. Don't let her win. Don't let her rewrite history." My father's next words were harder to read, written smaller, more cramped, like he was running out of space or time or strength. "Build your own family, Marissa. Your own legacy. Find people who see your worth the way I always did. Have children if you want them, or build a life of purpose and meaning in whatever way feels right to you. Don't let Eleanor's cruelty define your future. You are so much more than the daughter of a weak man and a cruel woman. You are yourself, brilliant and strong and capable of extraordinary things." And the final paragraph was only a few lines, but they destroyed me. "Know that every single day of your life I was proud to call you my daughter. Every report card, every quiet conversation, every moment you chose kindness over cruelty made me grateful that somehow, despite everything, you came into my life. Forgive your mother if you can. I never could, and that failure haunts me. But maybe you're strong enough to let go of the anger I carried. Maybe you can be free in a way I never was. All my love always. Dad." I folded forward over the letter, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. Russell pulled me against his chest and let me cry, his hand running soothingly over my hair, the way my father used to do when I was small and sad. "He knew," I choked out between sobs. "He knew she was going to kill him, and he didn't stop her. He just accepted it." "He was dying anyway," Russell said quietly. "And he was exhausted, Marissa. Exhausted from years of fighting Eleanor, from trying to protect you and Lydia, while his body was giving out. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is accept what they can't change and prepare for what comes after." We sat like that for a long time, my father's letter clutched in my hands, my tears soaking into Russell's shirt. When I finally had no tears left, when I'd cried myself empty, Russell gently eased me back so he could look at my face. "There's one more thing Henry wanted you to know," he said, his voice careful. "He asked me to tell you after you read the letter. He said the timing mattered." I wiped at my face with shaking hands. "What is it?" Russell took a breath, choosing his words with obvious care. "Your father wanted you to know that even though Eleanor tried to erase you from his will, even though she succeeded for 5 years, she never actually got what she wanted most." "What do you mean?" "The business. Cole and Blake Accounting. It was worth more than everything else combined, and Eleanor assumed it would pass to her with the rest of the estate." Russell's expression softened into something almost like satisfaction. "But the business partnership agreement we signed 40 years ago supersedes any will. When Henry died, his share of the company automatically transferred to me. Eleanor has never been able to touch it. and Henry made me promise that when the time was right, when you were ready, I would transfer his share to you. The revelation about the business left me stunned. All these years I'd assumed my mother had inherited everything, had complete control over my father's legacy. The thought that she'd never been able to touch the company, that it had been safe all along, felt like a small victory in a war I was only beginning to understand I'd been fighting. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked Russell, my voice still rough from crying. He was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting on my shoulder. "Because Henry made me promise to wait until you were ready, until you'd found your own strength and didn't need the money to define who you were. He didn't want you to see the business as rescue or inheritance. He wanted you to see it as recognition, as proof that you'd already become everything he hoped you'd be." Russell's eyes were wet now too. And he was right. Look at what you've built on your own. Your career, your independence, your integrity. You didn't need his money to become successful. You did that yourself. I looked at this man who'd been a constant presence at every major event of my childhood, always in the background, always steady and reliable. I'd never questioned why Russell had stayed so loyal to my father, why he'd maintained contact even after the funeral, when so many of my father's other friends had drifted away, absorbed back into their own lives. "You really loved him," I said quietly. "Like a brother. He was my brother in every way that mattered." Russell's voice was thick with emotion. "We weren't related by blood, but that didn't make the bond any less real. I met Henry in September of 1971, first day of freshman year at Ohio State. I was a scholarship kid from Cleveland, first in my family to go to college. My father had left when I was 6. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. I showed up on campus with everything I owned in 2 duffel bags, and no idea how I'd survive 4 years in a world where everyone seemed to come from money and privilege." He smiled at the memory, sad and fond at once. "Henry was my roommate. Random assignment. He came from this established Ohio family, old money, the kind of background where college was assumed, not hoped for. I was terrified he'd request a room change the minute he saw me. Instead, he helped me unpack, took me to dinner in the cafeteria, treated me like an equal from day one. When I told him I'd have to work part-time to cover expenses, the scholarship didn't pay, he got a job too. Said if I was working, he should learn what that was like." I'd never heard this story. My father had rarely talked about college, and when he did, it was always about classes or professors, never about his personal life. "We built the accounting firm together after graduation," Russell continued. "I had the skills, but no capital, no connections. Henry had both, but insisted we be equal partners. 50-50, split both our names on the door. When he married Eleanor in 1983, he asked me to be his best man. I stood next to him at that altar and watched him promise his life to a woman I knew was wrong for him." Russell's jaw tightened. "But he loved her, or thought he did, so I kept my concerns to myself. That's a regret I'll carry forever." "You knew what she was like even then." "I knew she was manipulative, controlling, more interested in Henry's money than in Henry himself. But I didn't know she was capable of murder. I didn't know she'd spend decades psychologically torturing you while pretending to be a devoted mother and wife." He looked at me directly. "When you were born in 1986, Henry asked me to be your godfather. He wanted it officially recognized, wanted my name on documents. Eleanor vetoed it. Said it wasn't appropriate that godfathers should be family. Henry backed down because he always backed down when Eleanor pushed. But he told me privately that I was your godfather anyway, whether Eleanor acknowledged it or not. That if anything ever happened to him, I was to watch over you." The weight of that responsibility, carried for 38 years, suddenly made sense of everything. Russell hadn't been helping me out of loyalty to a dead friend. He'd been fulfilling a sacred promise to protect me. "I suspected Eleanor's abuse for years," Russell admitted, his voice dropping to something heavy with guilt. "The way she spoke to you at family gatherings, the casual cruelty disguised as concern. The way your face would close off whenever she entered a room. I wanted to confront her, wanted to tell Henry to do something decisive, but Henry begged me not to interfere directly. He said if Eleanor felt cornered or threatened, she'd take it out on you and Lydia. He thought if he kept the peace, if he played along with her games, he could protect you both from the worst of her venom. Russell's voice cracked. He was wrong, and by the time he realized how wrong he was too sick and too weak to fight anymore. "It's not your fault," I said quietly. "I failed him while he lived," Russell said, and there were tears on his cheeks now. "I watched him suffer in that marriage, watched Eleanor slowly poison his life and then literally poison his body, and I didn't stop it. I can't change that. But I won't fail him in death. I promised him I'd protect you, and I will keep that promise no matter what it costs." "What has it cost?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Russell pulled out his phone and showed me a banking app, a retirement account with a balance significantly lower than what a successful accountant should have after 40 years of work. "I've spent $50,000 of my retirement savings in the last 6 months. Private investigators to track down Sarah Collins and Dr. Morrison, lawyers to review the will and insurance documents, forensic accountants to trace Eleanor's spending and prove the fraud. Every time we needed another expert or another piece of evidence, I paid for it." "Russell, you can't—" "Henry left me $25,000 in his will," Russell continued. "A token really compared to the business share. I've spent double that amount to bring Eleanor to justice. I don't care about the money, Marissa. Money can be earned back. Henry's memory can't. Your father's legacy can't." He put the phone away and took both my hands in his. "You deserved better than what Eleanor gave you. Henry deserved better than how Eleanor destroyed him. If it takes everything I have to make sure the world knows the truth, it's a price I'll gladly pay." I looked at this man, 72 years old, who'd sacrificed his own financial security to protect me, to honor a promise made to a dying friend. He'd been there all along, a guardian I hadn't recognized, a father figure who'd loved me without the title or recognition. "Thank you." I whispered the words, inadequate, but all I had. "For everything. For not giving up. For believing me. For—" Russell's phone rang, cutting through the moment. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted, became focused and alert. "It's the prosecutor's office," he answered, putting it on speaker so I could hear. "Mr. Blake, this is District Attorney Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling to let you know we've reviewed all the evidence your team compiled. The confession video, the medical records, Dr. Morrison's testimony, the documents from Eleanor Cole's basement. We have enough to proceed." There was a pause, heavy with significance. "We're filing charges tomorrow morning. First-degree murder, conspiracy, insurance, fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. This is really happening." The arrest happened the following morning at Ohio Valley Hospital, where Eleanor had remained under observation for stress-related chest pains. Russell and I were there, standing in the hospital lobby with Calvin Moore and District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, when the uniformed officers arrived to execute the warrant. I'd been given the choice to stay away to let this happen without witnessing it, but I needed to be there. I needed to see justice beginning to unfold with my own eyes. 2 officers, 1 male and 1 female, took the elevator to the 4th floor, while news crews gathered outside the main entrance. Someone had tipped off the media, which meant this would be broadcast across every local channel. Eleanor's very public confession was about to be followed by her very public arrest. We waited in tense silence. Sarah Mitchell checked her watch repeatedly, her prosecutor's mind likely running through every possible complication. Russell stood beside me, solid and steady, his hand on my shoulder. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, the elevator doors opened and the officers emerged with Eleanor between them. She was still in her hospital gown, a thin robe thrown over it, her wrists secured in handcuffs in front of her body. Her hair, usually so carefully styled, hung limp around her face. Without makeup, she looked older, smaller, diminished. But her eyes held the same fury I'd seen all my life. "This is a mistake." Eleanor's voice echoed through the lobby, shrill and desperate. "This is all a lie. My daughter is a manipulative liar. She's always been disturbed, always trying to destroy this family." She struggled against the officer's grip, though they held her firmly but professionally. I did nothing wrong. Nothing. Henry died of natural causes. Everyone knows that. The officers read her rights as they guided her toward the exit where the news cameras waited. I followed at a distance close enough to hear but far enough to stay out of the media's immediate line of sight. Sarah Mitchell had warned me that anything I said or did today could potentially be used by Eleanor's defense team, so I needed to be careful, controlled. Outside, the cameras surged forward. Microphones thrust toward Eleanor's face as reporters shouted questions over each other. "Mrs. Cole, did you murder your husband? How do you respond to the charges? What do you say to your daughter?" Eleanor twisted toward the cameras, her face contorted with rage. "I am innocent. This is a conspiracy orchestrated by an ungrateful child who wants to steal my dead husband's money. Marissa Cole is a liar and a thief, and I will prove it in court." The officers loaded her into the back of a police cruiser. Through the window, Eleanor's eyes found mine in the crowd. For a moment, we stared at each other across the distance, and even through the glass and the chaos, I could feel the weight of her hatred. Her lips moved, forming words I could read, even though I couldn't hear them. "You'll never be rid of me." Then the cruiser pulled away, taking her to county jail for booking an arraignment. The charges were extensive. First-degree murder conspiracy, insurance fraud totaling over $2 million, forgery of legal documents, witness tampering in the case of nurse Sarah Collins. The district attorney's office had added up every crime they could prove, building a case that carried a potential sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Eleanor's bail was set at $2 million, a deliberate irony not lost on anyone following the case. The exact amount she'd stolen through insurance fraud would be required to secure her temporary freedom. She couldn't pay it. Despite all the money she'd collected over the years, Eleanor had spent nearly everything. The house was mortgaged. Her bank accounts, once flush with insurance payouts, had been drained by years of compulsive spending. She would remain in jail until trial. That same afternoon, Dr. Richard Morrison turned himself in. Unlike Eleanor, he came quietly accompanied by a defense attorney who'd negotiated a plea deal in advance. Calvin Moore called to give me the update while I sat in Russell's car outside the hospital, still processing everything that had just happened. "Morrison's cooperating fully," Calvin said. "His lawyer worked out an agreement with the DA. If he testifies against Eleanor and provides all evidence in his possession, his charge gets reduced from first-degree murder to voluntary manslaughter. He's looking at 15 years with possibility of parole after 10. "That seems light for helping kill someone," I said, though I understood the calculation. Without Morrison's testimony, proving Eleanor's direct involvement would be harder. "It's the deal we had to make to ensure conviction," Calvin explained. "And Morrison's giving us everything. Love letters from Eleanor that explicitly discuss making Henry's death look natural. Text messages coordinating the exact timing of the medication increase. Even a recording of Eleanor rehearsing what she'd say to the police when Henry died, practicing her grieving widow performance." He paused. The man kept evidence like he knew someday he'd need it. Maybe some part of him always knew Eleanor would betray him. Morrison's evidence painted a picture of meticulous planning and cold-blooded execution. Eleanor hadn't acted in passion or panic. She'd spent months crafting the perfect murder, manipulating Morrison through a combination of false love and shared greed. Every detail had been calculated, from the insurance policy timing to the funeral arrangements she'd made weeks before my father actually died. Paul Anderson faced his own reckoning, though it came from a different direction. While he hadn't been charged with any crimes related to my father's death, the IRS had taken an interest in the $480,000 he'd paid to Eleanor over 20 years. Unreported gifts of that magnitude triggered tax implications neither Paul nor Eleanor had properly addressed. He was facing civil penalties and back taxes that his accountant estimated would exceed $200,000. But the financial consequences were nothing compared to the personal ones. Paul's wife, Catherine, whom I'd never met, filed for divorce within 48 hours of the story breaking. The revelation of a decades-long affair and an illegitimate daughter had destroyed whatever remained of their marriage. Paul's grown children, legitimate heirs who'd built their own lives, wanted nothing to do with him. His political connections, carefully cultivated over years of networking and donations, evaporated overnight. No one wanted to be associated with the man who'd been Eleanor Cole's accomplice and victim simultaneously. Russell showed me the news coverage that evening, though part of me didn't want to see it. Every major outlet in Ohio had picked up the story. Some national news programs had started covering it too, drawn by the viral video and the salacious details. Prominent socialite arrested for murder conspiracy. Ohio woman's Facebook confession leads to charges. Thanksgiving dinner turns into criminal investigation. My mother's face was everywhere, frozen in moments of rage or fear or defiance. The screenshots from the live stream had become iconic, shared thousands of times with commentary ranging from supportive to vicious. Public opinion had turned decisively against her. The church had issued a formal statement condemning her actions. Former friends gave interviews about how they'd always suspected something was off. People who'd attended that Thanksgiving dinner sold their stories to tabloids. And through it all, I felt strangely numb. This was justice. This was what I'd wanted, what I'd worked for, what my father had hoped I'd achieve. Eleanor was facing the consequences of decades of manipulation and murder. Dr. Morrison was cooperating with authorities. Paul Anderson's comfortable life had imploded. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like excavating a mass grave, uncovering layer after layer of horror that had been buried beneath a facade of respectability. That night alone in my apartment, I looked at the business card Paul Anderson had given me weeks ago. I hadn't contacted him since our meeting at the diner. I wasn't sure I ever would. He was my biological father, but he was also a stranger who'd enabled my mother's worst behaviors through weakness and fear. Whatever relationship we might have had died long before either of us knew I existed. I put the card in a drawer and closed it, choosing to leave that door unopened. The months between Eleanor's arrest and the trial moved with agonizing slowness each day, bringing new developments in the case, while I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. Sarah Mitchell kept me updated on every filing, every piece of evidence, every witness who agreed to testify. The prosecution team was building something massive and unassailable, a case so thorough that even the most skeptical juror would have to acknowledge the truth. Sarah Collins, the nurse who'd administered the fatal dose, had agreed to testify in exchange for full immunity from prosecution. Her lawyer argued successfully that she'd been manipulated and threatened by Dr. Morrison, that she'd acted under duress and had lived with the guilt for 5 years. Her testimony would be crucial, the moment-by-moment account of that final night, the orders that seemed wrong, the death that followed too quickly to be coincidental. Russell spent weeks working with forensic accountants, creating a timeline of every dollar Eleanor had stolen, spent, and hidden. The financial trail was damning, showing a pattern of fraud that stretched back decades. The document examiners had analyzed the forged will, identifying at least 15 distinct differences between Henry's real signature and Eleanor's clumsy attempt at replication. The church livestream video had been authenticated by digital forensics experts who confirmed it hadn't been edited or manipulated. Every potential weakness in the case had been reinforced until the evidence felt unbreakable. But the legal machinery moved slowly, and while the prosecutors built their case, I had to figure out how to live in the wreckage Eleanor had left behind. Lydia moved into my apartment 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrest. She'd tried staying with Aunt Patricia, but the house was filled with family photos and memories that made healing impossible. My small apartment, cramped with 2 people instead of 1, became our refuge. We were like strangers learning to be sisters, navigating years of manufactured rivalry and genuine hurt. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday night over takeout Chinese food. Lydia had been quiet all day, moving through the apartment like a ghost, and finally she set down her chopsticks and looked at me directly. "I need to understand something," she said. "Why did you keep paying Mom's bills, even after everything she did to you, even after you knew she hated you? You kept giving her money. Why?" I'd asked myself the same question 1,000 times. Because I thought it was the right thing to do. Because Dad would have wanted me to take care of the family. Because I was too afraid of what would happen if I stopped. I paused, considering my own motivations. And maybe because some part of me still hoped that if I was good enough, helpful enough, selfless enough, she might finally love me. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. She was never going to love you. She wasn't capable of it. And I'm not sure she loved me either. She just liked controlling me. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand. I've started seeing a therapist. Dr. Wilson, she specializes in family trauma. She says what Mom did to both of us was emotional abuse. That the favoritism was just another form of manipulation. How's that going? The therapy? It's hard, really hard. I have to look at my whole life and realize that almost nothing about it was real. The person I thought I was, the golden child who could do no wrong, she was just a character Mom created to control me. Lydia's voice shook. But Dr. Wilson says I can build a real identity now. Figure out who I actually am instead of who Mom wanted me to be. Over the following months, I watched Lydia transform in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. She got her first job at a small independent bookstore near the university, and she loved it with an intensity that caught both of us off guard. She'd come home exhausted from standing all day, smelling like old paper and coffee, and she'd be happier than I'd ever seen her. Mom always told me I was too delicate to work, Lydia said one evening while we made dinner together. She said working was for people who didn't have other options, that I was meant for better things. But this feels good. Earning my own money, making my own decisions. I feel stronger than I've ever felt in my life. I helped her open her own bank account, something she'd never had despite being 35 years old. We sat at the bank while she filled out paperwork, and when the account manager handed her a debit card with her name on it, Lydia actually cried. It was such a small thing, such a basic marker of adult independence, but for her, it represented freedom she'd never known. The public interest in our story hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified as the trial date approached. Local news stations requested interviews, and after discussing it with Sarah Mitchell, I agreed to speak with a few carefully selected journalists. I talked about financial abuse, about how abusers use money to maintain control, about the importance of economic independence. One interview led to an invitation to speak at a women's shelter downtown. I almost declined, terrified of public speaking, but Russell encouraged me to go. "Your father would be proud of you using this platform to help others," he said. The shelter was small, maybe 30 women and children living in shared rooms, escaping situations I could barely imagine. I stood in their common room and told them my story, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a survivor who'd found her way to the other side. I talked about the small steps toward independence, about opening bank accounts and building credit, and learning to trust yourself. Lydia came with me to the second speaking event at a community center that focused on elder abuse awareness. My father had been 69 when he died, and the prosecutors had emphasized that aspect of the case. Elderly victims of financial and physical abuse often went unrecognized, dismissed as natural decline, rather than deliberate harm. At the end of my talk, Lydia stood up from the audience and asked to speak. I hadn't known she was planning this, and I watched with surprise as she walked to the front of the room. "I'm Marissa's sister," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "And I need to say something. I was complicit in my sister's abuse. I laughed when our mother mocked her. I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. I accepted the favoritism without questioning what it was doing to Marissa, and I'm deeply ashamed of that." She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I can't undo the past, but I can be better going forward. If you're in a situation where someone in your family is being abused, don't stay silent like I did. Speak up. Intervene. Don't let fear or comfort keep you from doing what's right." The audience erupted in applause, people standing and clapping until Lydia had to sit down because she was crying too hard to continue. Afterward, at least a dozen women approached us to share their own stories of sibling relationships damaged by parental manipulation, of healing that seemed impossible but wasn't. We were finding purpose in the pain, building something meaningful from the ruins Eleanor had left behind. 6 months after Eleanor's arrest, 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, my phone rang while I was at work. Sarah Mitchell's name appeared on the screen, and I stepped into an empty conference room to take the call. "Marissa, there's been a development," she said, and something in her tone made my stomach drop. "Eleanor's defense attorney just filed a motion. She's changing her plea to not guilty by reason of insanity." The insanity defense failed to gain traction during the pretrial hearings. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined Eleanor and found her fully competent, capable of understanding right from wrong, and criminally responsible for her actions. Her lawyers pivoted to a different strategy, one that painted her as a victim of Dr. Morrison's manipulation, a lonely wife controlled by a predatory doctor who'd orchestrated everything. It was a desperate argument, but it was all they had. The trial began on a cold morning in late October, nearly a year after that catastrophic Thanksgiving dinner. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the hallway outside. Media filled the press gallery. Members of St. Augustine Church sat in the public seating, their faces somber. Domestic violence advocates wore purple ribbons in solidarity. Russell sat directly behind me, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. Eleanor entered through the side door in an Orange County jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She'd lost weight during her months in jail, her face drawn and aged beyond her 66 years. Her expensive clothes and jewelry were gone, replaced by institutional cotton and bare wrists. She looked diminished, smaller than I remembered, but when her eyes swept the courtroom and found mine, they still burned with undiluted hatred. Her defense attorney, Marcus Webb, was skilled and expensive, paid with what little remained of Eleanor's assets. He opened by describing Eleanor as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage manipulated by a cunning doctor who'd exploited her loneliness. He portrayed her as mentally fragile, a victim herself, someone who'd made terrible choices under the influence of a predatory man. The prosecution's case unfolded over 8 days. Dr. Morrison testified for 2 full days, his voice flat and broken as he described the affair, the planning, the execution. Sarah Mitchell made him read Eleanor's text messages aloud, each one more damning than the last. "It needs to be done this week. We've waited long enough. Make sure the dosage is high enough that there's no chance of survival. I've already planned the funeral. Just do your part." Sarah Collins took the stand on day 4, describing that terrible night shift in meticulous detail. The unusual medication order, Morrison's angry insistence when she questioned it, Henry's rapid decline, the envelope of cash and the job offer that had sent her fleeing to Arizona. She cried through most of her testimony, and I believed her remorse was genuine. Russell presented the financial evidence with the precision of someone who'd spent 40 years working with numbers. Charts showed Eleanor's spending patterns before and after Henry's death. Within 2 weeks of receiving the insurance payout, she'd purchased a Mercedes. Within 3 months, she'd spent over $300,000 on furniture, jewelry, and travel. The prosecution argued that these were not the actions of a grieving widow or someone mentally unstable. They were the actions of someone celebrating her freedom. On day 7, I took the stand. My hands shook as I placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Sarah Mitchell's questions were gentle, guiding me through decades of memories I'd tried to bury. I described my childhood, the constant comparisons to Lydia, the casual cruelty disguised as motherly concern. I talked about the day Eleanor screamed that I wasn't Henry's real daughter, about the 10 years I'd stayed away trying to heal. I described paying Eleanor's bills while she mocked me supporting the woman who'd murdered my father because I thought it was what he would have wanted. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested I was motivated by money, that I'd manufactured this entire case to steal my sister's inheritance. He brought up my estrangement from the family, implying I was an unreliable narrator with an axe to grind. I looked him directly in the eye and said, "I stayed away from my mother to survive her cruelty. I'm here now to make sure no one else's father is murdered for insurance money by the person who promised to love them." The courtroom was silent when I stepped down. Closing arguments lasted a full day. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was clear and certain. Guilty on all counts. Eleanor's face remained impassive as the verdicts were read, but her hands clenched the table edge so tightly her knuckles went white. Before sentencing, Judge Catherine Morrison asked, "Does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Eleanor stood slowly, and every person in that courtroom leaned forward. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I have something to say." Marcus Webb leaned over and whispered urgently to Eleanor, his hand on her arm, trying to pull her back down into her seat. But Eleanor shook him off with a sharp gesture and remained standing, her spine straight, her chin lifted in that familiar posture of superiority I'd seen my entire life. The judge nodded permission for her to speak, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I need you to understand something." Eleanor began, her voice clear and measured. "I am not the villain in this story. I am a victim of circumstances no woman should have to endure." She paused as if gathering strength. "I gave Henry Cole the best years of my life, 36 years of marriage. I raised his daughters, managed his household, maintained his reputation in the community. I hosted countless dinner parties for his business associates. I attended every church function, every charity event, playing the role of the perfect wife." Her voice began to rise, gaining intensity. "And what did I get in return? A husband who knew from the beginning that one of his daughters wasn't his biological child, yet loved her more than his actual daughter. A man who plotted behind my back to leave me penniless, to cut me out of his will as if I meant nothing, as if 36 years of service and sacrifice counted for nothing." I watched the jury's faces, saw confusion turning to something harder. Eleanor didn't seem to notice. "Henry drove me to Paul Anderson's arms." She continued, her tone shifting to something almost petulant. "He was cold, distant, more concerned with his precious business than with his wife's emotional needs. When I found comfort elsewhere, when I made one mistake in a moment of loneliness, I was punished for it for the rest of my life. That child, Marissa, became a constant reminder of my failure, my weakness. Every time I looked at her, I saw my mistake staring back at me." Lydia made a small sound beside me, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Russell's hand found my shoulder and squeezed. "Dr. Morrison seduced me," Eleanor said, and now her voice took on a practiced victimhood that might have worked on someone who hadn't seen the evidence. "He pursued me relentlessly, made me believe he loved me, convinced me that Henry's death would be a mercy. He said Henry was suffering, that we'd be doing a kindness. I was lonely and vulnerable, and he exploited that." Marcus Webb had his head in his hands now, knowing his client was destroying any remaining shred of sympathy the jury might have held. "As for the money," Eleanor continued, oblivious to the damage she was inflicting on her own case, "I earned every penny. 36 years of maintaining a household, raising children who weren't grateful, supporting a husband who took me for granted. That insurance money was compensation for a lifetime of thankless service. I deserved it." The word "deserved" hung in the air like poison. Not a single person in that courtroom looked sympathetic. The jury members' faces had progressed from confusion to discomfort to outright disgust. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a moment, her fingers frozen over the keys as she stared at Eleanor in disbelief. Eleanor finally sat down, looking satisfied, as if she'd delivered a compelling defense, rather than a confession of absolute narcissism and zero remorse. Sarah Mitchell rose for the prosecution's closing argument, and she was brilliant in her restraint. She didn't need to be theatrical or emotional. The evidence and Eleanor's own words had done all the work. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah began, her voice calm and professional. "Over the past 8 days, you've heard extensive testimony about a calculated murder conspiracy. You've seen financial records, medical documents, text messages, and recorded conversations. But in case any doubt remained about Eleanor Cole's guilt or her state of mind, she just removed it herself." Sarah walked to the monitor and played the church live stream video one final time. Eleanor's voice filled the courtroom. "He was dying anyway. I just sped things along." "This woman," Sarah said, gesturing toward Eleanor, "is not insane. She's not a victim of manipulation. She is calculating, methodical, and utterly remorseless. She murdered her husband for $2 million in insurance money. She forged his will to steal from his daughter. She paid bribes to silence witnesses. And even now, facing the consequences of her actions, she takes no responsibility. She blames her husband for her affair. She blames her daughter for existing. She blames her lover for executing the plan she orchestrated. Sarah paused, letting her words settle over the jury. Henry Cole is dead because his wife valued money more than his life. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant's own words spoken on that live stream and again today in this courtroom prove her guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Justice demands a guilty verdict. Henry Cole's memory demands it. And every person who trusted Eleanor Cole and was betrayed deserves to see her held accountable. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Each morning we gathered in the courtroom waiting for word. Each evening we returned home with no verdict, the waiting stretching our nerves to breaking point. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the buzzer sounded. The jury had reached a decision. We filed back into the courtroom. Eleanor was brought in from the holding cell, her face carefully blank. The jury filed in, not one of them looking at the defense table. That was the tell, Russell whispered to me. When a jury won't look at the defendant, they've voted to convict. The forewoman stood, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes that had turned hard over the course of the trial. Judge Morrison asked for the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Eleanor Marie Cole, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in the 1st degree. Guilty of insurance fraud. Guilty of forgery. Guilty of witness tampering. Guilty, guilty, guilty. On every single count. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the verdict, giving us time to prepare our victim impact statements. Ohio law allowed anyone directly harmed by Eleanor's crimes to speak before the judge determined her sentence. Lydia Russell and I all chose to address the court. Sarah Mitchell helped us understand what was appropriate, what would be most effective, though she emphasized that whatever we needed to say, we should say it. Lydia spoke first. She sat in the witness box, looking smaller than usual, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her voice was steady. Growing up as Eleanor Cole's favorite daughter sounds like a blessing. Everyone assumed I had it easy while my sister struggled. But favoritism is just another form of abuse. My childhood was a prison of perfection where love was conditional on absolute obedience. I was never allowed to fail, never allowed to be human, never allowed to become my own person. My mother didn't love me. She owned me. And when I finally tried to break free, she threatened to destroy me the same way she'd destroyed my father. Lydia's voice cracked on the last words, and she had to pause to collect herself. My sister saved me. Marissa showed me what real strength looks like, what unconditional love looks like. I only wish my father had lived to see us become true sisters. Russell went next, and watching this 72-year-old man stand before the court was one of the most powerful moments of the entire trial. Henry Cole was my brother in every way that mattered, he began. I knew him for 47 years. I watched him build a business, raise his daughters, and try to love a woman who was incapable of loving him back. In his final days, he knew his wife wanted him dead. He told me so. That knowledge haunted his last hours. He died afraid, betrayed by the person who'd promised to cherish him. Eleanor Cole didn't just take his life. She took his peace, his dignity, and his ability to die without fear. That is unforgivable. Then it was my turn. I'd written and rewritten my statement dozens of times, trying to find words adequate to 38 years of pain and the final gift of justice. I stood at the podium and looked directly at my mother, who sat at the defense table with the same blank expression she'd worn since the verdict. Eleanor Cole, I began, and my voice was stronger than I'd expected. You spent 38 years making me feel worthless. You told me I was a disappointment, a burden, a mistake. You mocked my accomplishments and celebrated my failures. You made me believe I was unlovable, unwanted, fundamentally flawed. But you were wrong about me. I paused, letting that sink in. I am a successful businesswoman. I built a career through my own hard work. I have people who love me for who I am, not for what I can give them. I have integrity you will never understand, because you've never valued anything that couldn't be spent or displayed." My mother's expression didn't change, but I saw her hands tighten slightly on the table edge. "You killed a good man for money you didn't need. You destroyed your daughter's childhood for control you couldn't maintain. You manipulated everyone who trusted you and felt no remorse when they suffered. And now you'll spend the rest of your life in a cage, just like you caged Lydia and me in different ways for decades. The difference is, we escaped. We're free. You never will be." I sat down without tears, without trembling. I'd said what needed saying. Judge Morrison adjusted her reading glasses and looked at Eleanor with an expression of profound distaste. "Mrs. Cole, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of conspiracy to commit murder in the first-degree insurance fraud forgery and witness tampering. I have reviewed the evidence extensively, and I find the cruelty and premeditation of your crimes to be among the most egregious I've encountered in my 20 years on the bench." The judge's voice was measured but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You murdered your husband not in passion or fear, but in cold calculation for financial gain. You forged legal documents to steal from your own daughter. You bribed witnesses to silence them. And through all of this, you have shown not one moment of genuine remorse. Therefore, I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole on the murder conspiracy charge plus 25 additional years on the combined fraud charges to be served consecutively. Mrs. Cole, you will die in prison." Eleanor's face remained completely blank, empty of any emotion. No fear, no anger, no sadness. Just a cold void where a human response should have been. The bailiff stood to escort her out. As they approached, Eleanor turned in her seat and looked directly at me. Her lips barely moved, but I heard the words clearly in the sudden silence. "You think you won." Then she was gone, led through the side door in chains, disappearing into the prison system where she would remain until death. I felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not even satisfaction. Just closure. The long nightmare was finally, definitively over. That evening, back at my apartment with Lydia and Russell, we sat in exhausted silence. The trial was over. Eleanor would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Justice had been served in the most complete way possible. Yet I felt hollow, drained of everything, except a persistent unease I couldn't name. "What did she say to you?" Lydia finally asked. At the end, when they were taking her away, I saw her mouth move. I'd been avoiding this question even to myself. She said, "You think you won," and then she said something else. I paused, the words bitter on my tongue. She said I'd become her someday, that bitterness destroys everyone eventually. Lydia's face went pale. "That's cruel. Even for her. But what if she's right?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them. What if this whole year, this quest for justice has turned me into something hard and cold? What if I've become so focused on punishing her that I've lost the parts of myself that made me different from her? Russell, who'd been quiet until now, set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Marissa, look at me." When I met his eyes, I saw exhaustion there, but also certainty. Eleanor spent her entire life consumed by greed and jealousy. She used people, discarded them, and felt nothing. You spent this year fighting for truth. You protected your sister, honored your father's memory, and made sure a murderer faced consequences. Those things are not the same. "But I wanted her to suffer," I admitted. "Part of me enjoyed watching her lose everything." "That's human," Russell said gently. "Justice isn't the same as revenge. You didn't fabricate evidence or lie or manipulate. You simply revealed the truth and let it do what truth does. Eleanor destroyed herself. You just made sure the world could see it." He reached across and squeezed my hand. "Your father chose you to inherit his legacy because he knew you had integrity. That hasn't changed. Don't let Eleanor's poison infect your last moments of victory. 2 days later, I received a call from a hospice center in Cleveland. Paul Anderson had requested to see me. His cancer had progressed rapidly, and he was in his final days. The nurse who called said he'd been asking for me repeatedly, that it seemed urgent. I almost didn't go. This man was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, someone whose weakness and cowardice had enabled years of my mother's abuse. But Lydia convinced me. "You'll regret it if you don't," she said, "and I'll come with you." The hospice room was small and sterile, filled with the quiet beeping of machines. Paul lay in the bed looking skeletal, his skin gray and papery. When we entered, his eyes opened and focused on me with surprising clarity. "Marissa," he whispered. "You came." I sat in the chair beside his bed while Lydia stood by the door. "The nurse said you wanted to see me." "I'm dying," he said, stating the obvious. "And I need to say something before I go. I'm sorry. For being absent. For being a coward. For sending money instead of being a father. For enabling Eleanor's cruelty by giving her what she wanted." His breathing was labored, each word an effort. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of the woman you became. Despite me, not because of me. You're stronger and braver than I ever was." I looked at this dying man who'd contributed nothing to my life except genetic material and financial support that had been weaponized against the man who actually raised me. I thought about Eleanor's words about bitterness destroying people. I thought about my father's letter telling me to forgive if I could. I reached out and took Paul's hand. It was cold and fragile as bird bones. "I forgive you," I said quietly. "Not for your sake, for mine, because I refuse to carry anger for the rest of my life." Paul's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he breathed. 3 weeks later, Russell called to tell me Paul had died. His estate reduced to $500,000 after the divorce settlement, and tax penalties had been left entirely to a scholarship fund. The Henry Cole Memorial Scholarship would provide college funding for children with incarcerated parents, helping them break cycles of trauma and build better futures. It was, I realized, Paul's final attempt at redemption, and perhaps the only truly good thing he'd ever done. The trial had been covered extensively by local news, but it wasn't until a journalist from The Atlantic reached out that the story took on national dimensions. Rebecca Chan spent 3 months interviewing me, Lydia Russell, and dozens of others connected to the case. Her article, published 2 months after Eleanor's sentencing, was titled "The Daughter Who Paid Her Abuser's Bills and Then Brought Her to Justice." The piece went viral within hours of publication. It wasn't just the murder conspiracy that captured attention, though. That was dramatic enough. It was the financial abuse, the decades of psychological manipulation, and the quiet strength of a daughter who'd supported her abuser while secretly building the case that would bring her down. Within days, the article had been shared over 200,000 times. My inbox flooded with messages from women across the country, each sharing their own stories of family members who'd exploited them financially, emotionally, or both. The media requests became overwhelming. Local stations, national morning shows, podcasts, documentary producers. Russell helped me filter through them, and eventually I agreed to appear on Good Morning America. It felt important to use this platform for something larger than my own story, to speak to the thousands of women who'd reached out saying they saw themselves in my experience. The interview was scheduled for early December, nearly 13 months after that Thanksgiving dinner that had started everything. I flew to New York with Lydia, both of us nervous but determined. The host, Jennifer Martinez, was warm and professional during the pre-interview, assuring us she wanted to tell the story with sensitivity and depth. The segment opened with a recap of the case footage from the trial and clips from the viral live stream. Then Jennifer turned to me with a question I'd been expecting but still dreaded. "Marissa, one thing that's puzzled many people following your story. How could you afford to pay your mother's $120,000 in debt over 5 years while working what you've described as a modest job as a financial analyst?" I'd discussed this moment with Russell and Lydia. We'd agreed it was time for the full truth. I took a breath and smiled. Jennifer, I need to come clean about something. I haven't been entirely honest about my professional life. My legal name is Marissa Cole, but for the past 10 years I've been working under a different name professionally. I'm known in the business world as Martha Collins. Jennifer looked confused, clearly not recognizing the name. The audience was silent, waiting. I'm the CEO and founder of Collins AI, I continued. It's a technology company specializing in artificial intelligence solutions for small and medium-sized businesses. We were recently valued at $5 million. The studio audience gasped audibly. Jennifer's professional composure slipped for a moment, her eyes widening. You're Martha Collins, the Martha Collins who was on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. I was 30 when I made that list. Yes, I built the company from nothing over 10 years, starting with freelance programming work and gradually expanding. I kept it completely separate from my family because I knew if my mother discovered I had money, she'd never stop demanding more. She'd find ways to extract everything I'd built. Jennifer leaned forward, fascinated. So you weren't poor. You were wealthy, yet you still paid her bills. I paid her bills because I hoped foolishly that it would finally earn her love. That if I was generous enough, selfless enough, she'd see my worth. I paused, choosing my words carefully. It didn't work. Love can't be purchased, and people like my mother aren't capable of it anyway. But paying those bills did give me something valuable evidence. Years of documentation proving her financial abuse, her manipulation, her complete dependence on money she claimed to despise me for not having. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. So you never actually needed the inheritance your mother tried to steal? Jennifer asked. No, I did this for my father's honor, to make sure his memory wasn't erased and his wishes weren't ignored. And to show women everywhere that you don't need anyone's permission to be powerful. You don't need to wait for an inheritance or a rescue. You can build your own empire on your own terms and use that strength to fight for what's right. The studio erupted in applause. Jennifer had tears in her eyes. That is an incredible revelation. What message do you have for women watching who might be in similar situations? I looked directly at the camera. You are not trapped, you are not powerless, and you are worth so much more than how your abusers value you. The Good Morning America appearance changed everything. Within a week, I'd received over 15,000 messages from people sharing their own stories of family abuse, financial manipulation, and the impossible choice between protecting yourself and honoring the people who hurt you. I couldn't respond to everyone individually, but I read every single message, and a pattern emerged. People needed resources. They needed legal help to escape financial entanglements with abusive family members. They needed counseling to process the guilt and grief that came with setting boundaries. They needed someone to tell them it was okay to walk away. The will dispute had finally been resolved in my favor. My father's estate minus legal fees and taxes amounted to approximately $1.8 million. I didn't need the money, and keeping it for myself felt wrong somehow, like profiting from my father's murder. So I made a decision that felt right in a way few decisions ever had. I would use his inheritance combined with $1 million from my own company earnings to create something that would honor his memory and help others. The Henry Cole Foundation launched 6 months after Eleanor's sentencing. Its mission was straightforward, providing legal aid, financial counseling, and mental health services to adult children trying to escape abusive family dynamics. We partnered with lawyers who specialized in estate law and financial abuse cases. We contracted with therapists who understood complex family trauma. We created educational resources about recognizing manipulation, setting boundaries, and building financial independence. Lydia became the Foundation's program director, a role she embraced with unexpected passion. She'd spent her entire life being controlled, and now she was helping others find freedom. She interviewed every potential client personally, designed the intake process, and built relationships with service providers across Ohio. Watching her discover her purpose was almost as rewarding as building the foundation itself. We scheduled the first fundraising gala for February 7th, what would have been my father's 75th birthday. The venue was a restored historical building downtown, elegant but not ostentatious. We invited everyone who'd been part of our Story Church members, who'd supported us, journalists who'd covered the trial, fairly advocates who'd reached out offering help. Sarah Collins flew in from Arizona. Even Dr. Morrison's ex-wife attended, seeking me out privately to apologize for not seeing the warning signs when her husband's behavior changed. Over 300 people filled the ballroom that evening. Russell sat at the head table looking distinguished in his dark suit, and when we announced him as the guest of honor for his unwavering loyalty and sacrifice, the standing ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. I watched this man who'd spent $50,000 of his retirement savings to bring my mother to justice, who'd kept a promise to a dying friend for 5 years, and I understood what family really meant. When it was time for my speech, I stood at the podium looking out at faces that represented every stage of this journey. I'd written and discarded a dozen drafts, but in the moment, I set aside my notes and spoke from the heart. My father taught me that family isn't about blood, I began. It's about who shows up when showing up is hard. Russell showed up investigating for years and spending his own money to find the truth. Sarah Collins showed up by telling the truth, even though it had cost her years of guilt and fear. Lydia showed up when it mattered most, choosing honesty over the comfortable lie our mother offered her. And all of you, by being here tonight, are showing up for the next person who needs help, the next daughter or son trapped in a situation they think they can't escape. I paused, looking around the room. This foundation exists because my father believed people deserved better than what life had given them. He believed in second chances and fresh starts. He believed that one person choosing to do the right thing could change everything. So thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that healing is possible. Thank you for showing up. The applause was thunderous, washing over me in waves that felt like absolution. I saw Lydia crying in the front row, Russell wiping at his eyes, strangers embracing each other in recognition of shared pain and shared hope. This was what justice looked like after the courtroom drama faded. This was the legacy my father had wanted, even if he'd never imagined it would take this particular form. As the formal program ended and people began mingling, a young woman approached me tentatively. She looked to be in her late 20s, professionally dressed, with nervous eyes that reminded me painfully of my younger self. "Miss Cole," her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Jennifer. I saw you on Good Morning America, and I've been following your story. My mother is just like Eleanor. The manipulation, the financial control, the constant guilt. I've been paying her rent for 3 years, even though she makes more money than I do. I don't know how to stop without feeling like I'm abandoning her." Her words could have been mine from 5 years ago. I saw myself reflected in her fear and her hope. "Can we talk?" Jennifer asked, her eyes pleading. "I need help. I don't know where else to turn." I took her hand and squeezed it gently. "That's why we're here. Let me introduce you to Lydia, our program director. She's going to help you figure this out." 1 year after Eleanor's conviction, the Henry Cole Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined that first night when I'd decided to honor my father's memory. We'd helped 78 families navigate the complex process of escaping financial abuse from parents, siblings, or adult children. We'd provided legal representation in 23 elder abuse cases, several of which resulted in criminal charges. We'd raised $2.3 million through donations, grants, and corporate partnerships. The foundation had become my life's work in a way my tech company never had been, and I'd never felt more purposeful. The success had brought unexpected opportunities. I'd been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about strengthening elder abuse laws and closing loopholes that allowed financial predators to exploit vulnerable family members. My testimony, grounded in both my father's story and the dozens of cases we'd handled through the foundation, helped shape legislation that was making its way through committee. Russell attended that hearing, sitting in the gallery, with pride written across his face. Lydia had transformed in ways that continued to amaze me. At 36, she was confident, independent, and engaged to a man named David Chen, an accountant she'd met when he volunteered to do pro bono financial counseling for the foundation's clients. He was kind and patient, everything our mother would have deemed not good enough, and Lydia loved him with a freedom she'd never known was possible. Watching her plan a wedding on her own terms with her own money was a joy I hadn't anticipated. But there was one piece of unfinished business that haunted me, and 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I arranged to visit Eleanor in prison. The Ohio Reformatory for Women was a bleak facility 2 hours from Columbus. I went alone despite Lydia and Russell both offering to accompany me. This was something I needed to do by myself, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps I was hoping for an apology, or for some sign that my mother had finally developed the capacity for remorse. Perhaps I just needed to see her one more time to confirm that I'd made the right choice. Eleanor had aged dramatically in the year since sentencing. Her hair had gone completely gray, and she hadn't bothered to dye it. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat across from me in the visitation room, separated by plexiglass and connected through a phone receiver that made her voice sound tinny and distant. "I knew you'd come eventually," she said without preamble. "You always were desperate for my approval." The old Eleanor was still there, clinging to her weapons even when they had no power left. "I came to tell you something," I said, my voice steady. "I forgive you." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "I don't want your forgiveness. I didn't do anything that requires forgiveness. I was a victim of circumstances, of Henry's coldness, of Morrison's manipulation. Everyone failed me, including you." I'd known she wouldn't apologize, known she'd never take responsibility or show genuine remorse. But hearing it confirmed something important. I hadn't come seeking closure from her. I'd come to give closure to myself. "I forgive you," I repeated, "not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I refuse to carry your poison for the rest of my life." I stood up, preparing to leave. "This is the last time we'll speak. Goodbye, Eleanor." I hung up the phone and walked out, leaving her shouting something I couldn't hear through the glass. I never looked back. The following week, Lydia and I prepared for Thanksgiving dinner. Not at the family mansion which had been sold with all proceeds going to the foundation. Not at some expensive restaurant trying to recreate artificial elegance. Instead, we'd rented a community center, a warm space with long tables, and the industrial kitchen where everyone could help prepare the meal. We'd invited everyone who'd been part of our journey. Russell, of course, who'd become the grandfather figure neither of us had ever had. Sarah Collins, who flew in from Arizona with her daughter. Calvin Moore, the retired detective who'd helped build the case. Members from St. Augustine Church who'd supported us even when it meant ostracizing one of their own. And 20 families we'd served through the foundation, people who understood what it meant to build a chosen family from the ashes of a biological one. No one was paying $15,000. Everyone was bringing a dish. It would be chaotic and imperfect and more beautiful than any meal my mother had ever orchestrated. I was setting up tables when Russell approached, carrying a small wooden box I'd never seen before. "I found this in Henry's belongings," he said quietly. "It was in the safety deposit box with the original will. He left specific instructions that I should give it to you after Eleanor was convicted and sentenced. He wanted you to have it when justice was done." My hands trembled slightly as I took the box. "What is it? Open it and see." My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid of the wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. It was tarnished with age, clearly worn for years, and when I lifted it from the box it felt warm in my palm, as if it still held some trace of the person who'd carried it. I opened the clasp with shaking hands. Inside was a tiny photograph professionally taken of my father in a hospital room holding a newborn baby. Me. His face was young, unlined, radiant with joy as he looked down at the infant in his arms. On the opposite side of the locket, engraved in script, so small I had to squint to read it, were 5 words: my daughter, my heart, Dad. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The tears came suddenly and completely, 38 years of wondering if I'd ever been truly loved, pouring out in great racking sobs that shook my whole body. Russell's hand was on my back, steady and comforting. "He had this made the week you were born," he said quietly. "Went to the jeweler himself, brought the hospital photo, had them size it so he could wear it under his shirt. Eleanor never knew. For 38 years, Henry wore you next to his heart every single day." I pressed the locket to my chest, feeling the weight of my father's love in a way I never had when he was alive. All those years I'd thought his affection was duty obligation, the responsibility of a man too kind to abandon a child who wasn't his. But this locket told a different story. He'd chosen me, deliberately, joyfully, from the very first day. I'd always been loved. I just couldn't see it through the fog of my mother's cruelty. Lydia appeared beside me, saw the locket, and started crying too. We held each other while Russell stood guard, giving us space to grieve and heal. An hour later, the community center was filled with voices and laughter, and the warm smell of a dozen different dishes crowding the buffet tables. Sarah Collins had brought her famous green bean casserole. Calvin Moore contributed homemade rolls. Families from the foundation had prepared traditional dishes from their own cultures, creating a feast that was chaotic and beautiful and nothing like the sterile perfection of my mother's curated dinners. When everyone was seated, I stood at the head of the main table with a glass of sparkling cider in my hand. The room quieted, faces turning toward me with warmth and attention I'd spent a lifetime craving from the wrong person. 3 years ago, I began, my voice steady now. I sat at a table where I was told I was worthless, where my own mother used Thanksgiving as an opportunity to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered to her. Today, I stand with people who taught me my worth. I looked around the room at faces that had become family. We've lost people. My father, who loved me better than I knew. Paul Anderson, who tried in the end to make amends. Even the version of my mother who might have been capable of love if she'd ever existed at all. But we've gained something far more important. We've built a family on truth, not blood. On choice, not obligation. On love that's freely given, not grudgingly withheld. I raised my glass higher. To Henry Cole, to the father who showed me that family is what we make it. The room erupted in, "To Henry," and the sound of glasses clinking, and I saw Russell wipe tears from his eyes. As the evening wound down and the noise settled into comfortable conversation, I stepped outside for air. The November night was cold and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. I stood looking up at them, thinking about everything that had brought me to this moment. Russell joined me, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "Are you all right?" "I spent so many years trying to earn love from someone who couldn't give it," I said. "I thought I was the problem, that if I just tried harder, achieved more, gave more, she'd finally see my worth." I turned to look at him. "But I'm not the problem. I never was." Russell's hand found my shoulder, gentle and paternal. "Henry knew that. That's why he fought for you, even in death. That's why he made sure you'd have the resources to build something good from the ashes of Eleanor's destruction." Through the window, I could see Lydia laughing with Sarah Collins, their heads bent together over some shared story. I could see families we'd helped through the foundation now helping each other, passing dishes and wiping children's faces and building connections that would last. I could see Russell's empty chair at the table waiting for him to return and continue telling stories about my father that kept his memory alive. And somewhere in a cell 2 hours away, Eleanor sat alone. Still clinging to her victimhood narrative, still blaming everyone but herself, still consumed by the bitterness that had poisoned her entire life. Eleanor had been wrong. Bitterness didn't destroy everyone, only those who chose to nurture it. I fastened my father's locket around my neck, feeling its weight settle against my heart where it belonged. Then I returned to the table, to Lydia's bright laughter and Russell's warm stories and the family I'd built from truth and choice and love. I was once called a failure, a disappointment, a mistake. Now I was a survivor, a leader, a daughter who'd honored her father's memory by becoming everything they'd said I never could be. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. And that is the story of Marissa Cole, a woman once called a failure, who became the hero of her own life. From that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, she exposed her toxic mother's crimes, brought a murderer to justice, and most importantly, she found her true family. Not a family bound by blood, but a family built on love, honesty, and courage. Eleanor thought she could destroy Marissa with cruel words and heartless actions. But she was wrong. Marissa didn't just survive, she rose up stronger, successful, and became an inspiration to thousands of other women trapped in toxic family relationships. Now I want to hear from you. If you were Marissa, could you forgive Eleanor? Or do you believe some sins are unforgivable? Have you ever experienced a similar situation where you faced favoritism or abuse from your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to read your story. If this video touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear this message. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video. Stay strong and stay blessed.